All right, everybody, welcome to another episode of the Break the Rules live stream. I am your host, Lev Polyakov, and we are here today with Uberboyo, and for the very first time, we are here with EssentialSalts. We are going to be talking about Friedrich Nietzsche, specifically the aesthetics conversation having to do with whether life itself is art, whether we are living through a kind of artwork working together with forces that are higher than us in order to produce this thing called life. And I would really want to start off with a specific quote from the book that we're also going to be talking about here, which is Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy. And it goes a little something like this. For this above all must be clear to us, as a cause of both humiliation and exaltation, that the whole comedy of art is not in any way performed for our benefit, for our improvement and edification, and that we are to an even lesser extent the real creators of that world of art. But we may assume that we are already images and artistic projections for the true creator of that world, and have our greatest dignity in meaning as works of art. For only as aesthetic phenomenon are existence and the world justified to eternity, while admittedly our consciousness of this meaning of ours scarcely differs from that which warriors in the painting have of the battle depicted on the canvas. Consequently, our whole knowledge of art is at bottom completely illusory, because we are not as knowing beings at one and identical with that essence, which as the sole creator and spectator of that comedy of art prepares for itself an eternal pleasure. Only insofar as the genius in the act of artistic creation fuses with that original artist of the world does he know something about the eternal essence of art. For in that state he miraculously resembles the uncanny image of the fairy tale, which can turn its size inside out and contemplate itself. Now he is simultaneously subject and object, simultaneously poet, actor, and spectator. Steph, what say you?
How are you doing, Lev? What's the crack? What's going on? So I can go in an absolutely tyrannical rant from here, and to kind of set some foundations for an awful lot of this, because people know that The Birth of Tragedy is Nietzsche's first book, but I don't think they understand why it's an important book and why Nietzsche wrote that book and why it is the foundation for an awful lot of what he was thinking about. Because if you read Nietzsche, you get the feeling that he's criticizing an awful lot of what is going on. He has bad views about modernity and about life. He has bad views about the way the world is going. And of course, the hidden predicate to this is that life or society or culture could be better. And there could be probably an ideal way that culture functions. There's probably the correct way that culture fires off where everything is working. That's the hidden predicate. And of course, you hear Nietzsche, he says a lot of like edgelord stuff. A lot of people on the right wing would read Nietzsche and be like, he would say, for example, that, Christianity's bad, Protestantism was bad, the Christian revival was bad, and the Dark Ages were the Dark Ages, they were bad. And you're kind of thinking, man, this guy just complains about fucking everything. What is he says nationalism is bad, it's too chuddish. You're like, what are we aiming for? What are we even trying to do here, Fred? What is the goal here? And of course, his very, very first work, he's discussing the golden age of the Greeks. And the golden age of the Greeks, which appeared in ancient Athens, and then also appeared in the Renaissance in a second iteration. And he talks very highly of the Renaissance as well. And, people would say, yeah, well, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Art is subjective. The Greeks carved a couple of statues. Why are we making a big deal out of this, guys? Like, it's whatever. It's just a little bit like, it's just art or something like this. But no. The golden age of the Greeks and the Renaissance, but the golden age of the Greeks specifically, is a unique event in history. It is the first time a large amount of things happen for the first time ever. It's a big, big deal. And there's actual, I would say there's objective ways you can look at it. Can I share my screen? I'm wondering if that's possible.
I'm going to add this to stage over here so you can see the screen in front of you. Is this what you want to show us, Steph?
I actually have them all in Chud Stack. If I could go over the Chud Stack, I could send you the links.
You could share your screen, please. Absolutely.
Okay. Present.
Yes.
Just let me turn off
And while Steph is doing this, be sure to like and subscribe and click that bell. And all the people who are watching this right now in the X spaces, if you look at the Jumbotron, you're going to see a link to YouTube. Click that link right now. It's going to bring you into YouTube. Anyway, here we go.
Okay, so you can see the tab, all the people who are on X. Yes, Lev, we have tricked you. We did a space, but now there's visuals. So if you want to see what's going on, you have to go to YouTube and you have to like and comment on Lev's. See, Lev, I'm shilling for you, Lev. I'm helping out here, man. I'm being a good buddy here.
Thank you, my friend.
Okay. So again, apologies. We have Keegan here who's like brilliant with this stuff as well. He's got some great episodes on it. I'm kind of hogging the mic a bit, but please just give me a moment to set this foundation. So how could you say there's something objective about the Greek Golden Age? So this is something that I first really saw clearly in Ian McGilchrist, interestingly. But obviously it's something that has been spoken about in philosophy quite a lot. So Ian McGilchrist, left hemisphere, right hemisphere, I'm sure people know about this. And he would often complain or suggest that art in cultures gets significantly influenced by, it almost looks like the whole culture gets possessed by left hemisphericism, is an awkward way of saying it. Now, what would that be? Well, that means that your art would be like modern art. It's a little bit disjointed. It's a little bit, excuse my French, autistic and spurgy. It's a little bit incomplete. What is right hemispheric art? When your brain is firing in all cylinders and the right hemisphere is working well, what do you get? You get realism. You get perfect three-dimensional attributes. You get clarity. You get full dimensionality. You get things having a sort of lifelike, soul-like aura. This is what you see in the Renaissance. This is what you see in the 19th century, just before the fall into modern art. And of course, this is what you see happen in ancient Greece. Now, what's fascinating is that ancient Greece was almost like the first time mankind ever, anywhere in history, ever, anytime, clicked fully into grasping fully representational three-dimensional art. And you can literally see the transitions happen in the statues. In 600 BC and 500 BC, as you're seeing on the screen tab, you have what we call Egyptian Koiros statues. Now, they're pretty good, but these things are abstractions. They're representations of youth. They look a little bit what we would call uncanny. They're like AI art now. They look just a little bit off. They don't really look...
Steph, I think you have to scroll down because right now I'm seeing paintings. I'm not seeing those Koiros statues. So they're very beautiful paintings. Don't get me wrong. But we have to...
Okay, I'll get another one. But please hold on with me for 1 second. I want to get the window.
And while Steph is getting the window, guys, if you want to support the show, patreon.com/breaktherules. Become a patron today. Steph, we were at an event where there was a lot of people. There was like 11 people in the audience, and they were people who pay $20 per month to become a patron to go to New York City to watch us with Jason Giorgiani talking for the Christmas special. It was an amazing time. We went out for Japanese food afterwards. And guys, if you want to have the same kind of an experience when Steph comes back, patreon.com/breaktherules. I'm posting the link in the chat. Become a patron today. You know me, Steph. Always be chilling. Here we go. Here's the Koiroses.
We're just hammering them with ads, man. This is just like solid like ads. Okay. I'm doing it too, Lev. I'm not blaming you. All right. So 600 BC, 540 BC, these are the Koiros. The Koiros are up top. Egyptian, you can see there's a little bit frosty glare. What happens then 500 BC? What happens in these 5 centuries before the birth of Christ? What happens? You have realism appear. These characters look like they're actual people. You could literally bring that to life. You could inject the magic juice in it and it would come to life and it would be an entity. They look like people with real expressions. They look like correct faces. It's perfect is maybe a strong word, but it's lifelike. It's real. It doesn't look uncanny. And this is a significant difference. This is the first time mankind has achieved this. Nothing in history had ever happened like this before. Now, this did not happen in a vacuum. This is the big deal. This did not happen in a vacuum. This happened during a huge burst in culture in every direction. What else happened at this time? The Olympics became a thing. The worship of the body, the perfection of the body. The Greek tragic theater became a thing. Before that, they had these Dionysian festivals. They had these statues, and all of a sudden it all synthesized and became essentially the foundation of cinema. This exploded, and we got tragic drama and art. This is why we call it the birth of tragedy, the birth of the tragic age. On top of this as well, you get, these are the Koiros once again. You're seeing the same sort of phenomenon. And we also get on top of this philosophy, materialism, the conception of nature, where we get the word thesis from, versus where we get the word physics from. This all comes at this point. Plato, Socrates, all of them arrive just at the end of this period. So something happens during the birth of tragedy in the Greek Golden Age. There is a paradigm shift in mankind, a gear shift. Something enormous happens. Now, I can rant about this for a long time, but I'll actually end it quickly here. This basically sails for about 600 years, 700 years, right into Rome. When you're making these like great Roman statues, this is called the lagoon, which they found actually, by the way, during the Renaissance. It inspired them. And then what happens is the frostiness comes back during the Christian age. There's a good image, but I can't find it here at the moment. And that frostiness shows that towards the end of Rome, they began to become more like the Koiros again. They weirdly lost this ability to be super representational. They fell into the Koiros, and then their culture imploded, and then they fell into the Dark Age. That's like literally objectively something that happened. So this is a really fascinating phenomenon, because the Renaissance, you see the same thing again. I'll explain that later. But this is the birth of this is when Nietzsche says the birth of tragedy. This is what he's talking about. Why he wrote that book? Because he thought when he was around Wagner that something like this was beginning to happen. The rise of science, the rise of philosophy, the rise of Wagner's tragic art, him trying to create like the synthesized art form. He thought it was about to kick off once again, and it was something real and something that will really help guide your philosophical studies if you're studying this. So I will leave that at that. And let's rock.
What you're seeing on the screen right now over here is what Steph was just referring to. This is during the late period of the Roman Empire. You started having these weird, almost like half primitive, but also half caricature type faces going on. And why do you think the caricature aspect also is going on here? Because I wouldn't necessarily say it's fully the same. Like, this expression over here, this guy, it does seem a little bit like some kind of a cartoon character somebody would draw today, as opposed to being some kind of a Sumerian relief like in 3 dimensions, right? So there is still something of the Roman spirit, you could say, that's almost like making fun of the decay state that they're in, but I don't know. I know, Salts, I'm curious, because we have never spoken before on the stream. This is your very first time. Thank you so much for coming in. What do you make specifically out of like this guy that you're seeing over here, these late antiquity type statues that started to come about versus what happened before?
Well, so what's very fascinating about the way Nietzsche talks about this, the birth of tragedy and the death of the tragic age as well. So Nietzsche, as you know from just looking through Birth of Tragedy, attributes the Greek, you would say the Greek genius to the interplay of Apollo and Dionysus. What does that mean? Apollo is the god of dreams. He's the god of boundary lines. He's the god of plastic arts, visual arts. And so there is something immensely creative about Apollo, but Apollo is also very intellectual and very artificial in a way. Whereas Dionysus stands for self-forgetting and dissolution and the erasure of boundary lines. And Nietzsche says that the genius of the Greeks was that they were able to contain Dionysus, the breaking of boundaries within a boundary, within a magic circle, as it were. That Dionysus is the image that stands for the breaking of all images. Somewhat paradoxical, but Nietzsche believes that Dionysus isn't even properly Greek. I mean, we know that Dionysus comes to Greece relatively late. This is what's dramatized in Euripides' The Bacchae, is Dionysus arriving from Asia. And Nietzsche says that wherever the Dionysian appeared in the rest of the world, like at the festival of Sacaea in Babylon, it overwhelmed and destroyed the society. The Sacaea was, very Saturnalian. You had a lot of role reversals. There was some wife swapping that went on. Nietzsche says it's the witch's brew of sensuality and violence, basically, was allowed to run free during these festivals. And due to this, basically, I don't know if this is actually true historically. I would say you could make a good argument that it's not, but Nietzsche basically believes that we could attribute a sort of an overdose of the Dionysian without any sort of Apollonian constraint to it, to the destruction of these early societies. And that what the Greeks were able to do was to give expression to the Dionysian, which is really, it is a form of, it's an art force, as he calls it, but it puts you in touch with what he calls the primordial pain and contradiction. It's something similar to what you were talking about in the quote you read at at the beginning, Lev, the primordial artist in some way, which Nietzsche is still very Schopenhauerian at this time, so he would say is something like the will, which is very different from how he would conceive of will and will to power in his later work. But in any case, that, what would we say? Nietzsche thinks that forgetting is an active and positive force. That when we are, when the conscious apparatus is unable to sort of like let go of its sense impressions, and that's the cause of so many of the pathologies of the conscious life that he'll talk about later in Genealogy of Morals, like resentment and the bad conscience and so on. And that there's something incredibly healthy and active about forgetting yourself, basically, going into frenzy or ecstasy, and that was the function of these Dionysian rituals. Now, bringing all this up, what Nietzsche says is that these Dionysian dithyrambs, these sort of like spontaneous poetic utterances, while people, Archilochus says, well, your wits are thunderstruck with wine. These eventually evolve into the Dionysian chorus and then into these plays that portray the dismemberment of Dionysus. And then eventually it's a masked actor portraying a hero or a god or something like that. But they're all sort of evolved from a play, not in the modern sense but more like a passion play in some sense, a religious depiction of a myth, or really some sort of deep truth or mystery that's revealed in the myth to the people. And so, relating this back to those late era Roman statues and what Nietzsche thinks happened with the death of tragedy, is that Nietzsche believes the Dionysian was excised. And he largely says that Socrates and the theoretical view of life is what is responsible for this in some way. It's sort of the beginning of this downslide. And that Socrates, as Nietzsche will later say, is sort of the first step in the direction of Christianity. One way to look at this might be that Socrates is very anti-artistic. Plato's Republic obviously designates all the sorts of poetry that they're going to regulate and control, the kinds of songs and musical modes that soldiers shouldn't be allowed to hear, or that the philosopher king shouldn't be allowed to hear, or that no one should be allowed to hear. Nobody should listen to music that makes them lachrymose and lazy, So in Socrates, everything is, as Nietzsche says, sort of bounded within this limited sphere of solvable problems. That's the human experience. The ideal state can be envisioned. Maybe it'll never be realized, but we can get there rationally. Your impulses, your emotions, they need to be called to order. Socrates says one of the only poems or like verses from the old poets that he agrees with is when in Homer, when Odysseus pounds his heart and says, brings his heart to order and says, "Be still, we've seen worse than this," something along those lines. And so there's very much a thread in Socratism, or what Nietzsche calls the theoretical, that's very much against the irrational and very suspicious of the artistic, very suspicious of the self-forgetting of Dionysus. And so when we go down the line a couple hundred years into Christianity, what that evolves into, in Nietzsche's view, is we move from this universal reason binding all men, sort of going after attacking and regulating the impulses and the artistic and the irrational. Christianity takes us to the extreme insofar as it makes war on everything worldly, everything that's of the flesh, in favor of the otherworldly. Socratism was a faith. It was a faith in reason. Christianity becomes sort of a faith in revelation and the immanentism of the kingdom of heaven, in Nietzsche's view. And looking at sort of what played out at the end of ancient Rome, you could look at it almost like more like a battle between the theoretical and the Christian. And interestingly enough, that seems to characterize what's going on in our world now as well. That the Dionysian doesn't seem to have much of a voice these days, or it does, but in certain fringes and in certain obscure places. Really, I mean, especially if you look at like the modern right wing, you're seeing sort of like you might see a resurgence of the Dionysian there versus the Christian. But on the left wing, it's mostly the Christian, right? And on the left wing, it's mostly the theoretical worldview. And
well, as far as degeneracy goes, I don't know if you would say that degenerate things are also having this Dionysian energy. But by the way, make sure that your tab for Spaces is actually open, because you're not coming on Spaces right now, even though you are still listed as a speaker. So I want this experience.
It is open, but I think this is the same problem we've had perhaps.
Yeah,
in the
Spaces broke down for Keegan before, but maybe just Maybe just power through, man. I think like
Yeah.
you're going to be good
Yeah,
enough.
I mean, the people here, Uberboyo, and you know what, we'll try to make the best of it. I would
All right.
just, yeah.
All you space cells go over to YouTube. Space
Yes,
cells.
that's right.
go to YouTube.
That's why what Keegan said right now is absolutely brilliant, and you are missing all of it right now. So while we're talking, Keegan, maybe like try a different microphone, that spaces thing, but whatever, we'll figure that out. Back to Steph here. What do you make specifically of Christianity? Yes, sir.
We'll get into that. Keegan, have you finished your thoughts,
yes.
by the way?
More or less. I mean, yeah, I'll kick it over to you. I talked for a long time. I'll try. I tried switching out my microphone. Can you hear me on Spaces? We'll see if anyone. It's popping up like I'm speaking, or it's making the icon like I am speaking there. But
yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's me. It's okay. Anyway,
let's I'd say sacrifice the space and just keep charging on, and
let's do it.
We can test the damage. All right, so I'm gonna build off this. I'm gonna screen share again, Mr. Lev. Yes, people need to be on YouTube. You got to be on YouTube for this. I'm sorry, space cells, get the hell out of here. Over to YouTube because I'll show you what's going on there. All right, so something that Mr. EssentialSalts is bringing up here that is so important to understand is this bizarre phenomenon, this bizarre, strange phenomenon where you have the birth of tragedy happening, which is, again, that Athenian Greek moment where all of these faces begin to click into gear. And Nietzsche observes this, Ian McGilchrist observes this, and he labels almost like a unity of two separate forces. So before the arrival of the tragic theater, you had a split in art. You had these Dionysian Maenads. They would go out into the forest and basically have a music festival. They'd all get drunk. They'd all probably fuck. And then they'd all play rock and roll music, basically. And they were crazy Dionysian. It was a breakdown Dionysian, barbaric, energetic movement. And you can think of this as like the natural origin where we all come from. Now, what sort of showed up in Greece is obviously this little tiny sliver of civilization, the Apollonian instinct, which is trying to be more sophisticated. And these guys are focused on making statues. And they probably went to Egypt and they probably got educated in Egypt, and they came back and they were like, rubbing their big Greek beards and being like, we're sophisticated and we're intellectuals. And they'd make these like completely frozen, dead, standing still, autistic Koiros statue. And this is the Apollonian instinct. This is the beginning of civilization and sophistication. And by themselves, they're kind of cool, but like they're split apart. They're like a left and a right hand doing their own thing. You're kind of like, all right, that's just not going to work. Man and woman separated. But when they synthesize, the golden age happens. They marry together, and you get the energy of a festival, and you get the energy of action and actors and music and the emotion, the emotive power of music. You get it bound to poetry, which is very sophisticated, plastic arts, the creative arts, the Apollonian arts, the Koiros arts, these sophisticated civilized arts. And that's the birth of tragedy. Civilization and barbarism marry together. It's the whole foundation of Nietzsche's ideas. You want both. People who read Nietzsche and be like, we must go back to barbarism and start like beating everyone up. And it's like, no, that's incorrect. Nietzsche is saying he wants a synthesis of barbarism, and he thinks what's missing in modernity is barbarism. But he's not against sophistication, and he's not against Apollonianism, these type of things. It's the synthesis that he's looking for. And then what happens is the civilizing force actually starts to overpower the barbaric force. So you can imagine for most of history, the barbaric force is strong. The civilized force begins to flicker up. They start making these statues. For a brief moment, they're in perfect unity, and they create the tragic golden age. And then the civilized force overpowers the barbaric, and Socrates shows up. And Socrates is a fucking incel. Socrates is the worst. Socrates is a absolute party poop. He's like a new atheist. He comes in and he's just like, with his nasally voice telling people everything is wrong. Now, what does Socrates do? Socrates is an intellectual. He's over-intellectual, is Nietzsche's sort of complaint. Socrates is a genius. He's brilliant. But it's not really, he's unconsciously representative of the over-civilizing force coming in essentially as a sterilizer, as coming in basically overthinking everything, and it kills off the barbarism and it kills off the Dionysian. And what do you see happen then? You see this golden age begins to stop. How can we tell this objectively? Again, this is why the art from this period is so fascinating. The tragic, dramatic poets have a like giant, it's a festival of Dionysus, a competition to make plays. And these plays are really musical and really like dramatic and really like, you know, bleeding heart romantic. And then what happens is they do well for like a century, we'll say. And then these new sort of plays come up and they're sort of like soap operas. It's really weird. And they're overly realistic. They're overly self-aware. It's like millennial humor begins to show up. You know, they become overly self-aware, and Socrates shows up at the same time because the culture is getting over-intellectual. And what happens literally immediately after this? You get Socrates, you get Plato, and then by the time of Aristotle, everybody knows those three all taught each other, or they all learned off each other. So we have the Golden Age, we have Socrates, we have Plato, we have Aristotle, and then Alexander the Great's father and Alexander the Great conquer Athens. So that you have a Golden Age, they just beat Persia. This is what's going on in history. The Spartans and the Persians and all this happens before. They win, they have their Golden Age, and then you have the foreigners from the north come in, the new barbarians from the north come in and obliterate the over-civilized, over-intellectual, uninstinctive, sterile culture. And then they come and take it over. So Greece, Athenian Greece actually loses when it becomes over-intellectual. So the cycle of civilization sort of plays out in this type of thing. Nietzsche points this out, and it's a really interesting thesis. People say Socrates is the foundation of philosophy. Nietzsche's saying no. Philosophy came out of the impulses from the era before him, and Socrates was the symbol of the sterilization and end of good philosophy. It's over-intellectualization, which is basically what all philosophy is. But of course, what was rising up philosophically before this was the profound materialism, and people like Heraclitus, they're called the pre-Socratics. Nietzsche's basically saying they're better because they came from a healthier period. So this is a really, really interesting thesis that has really interesting ways of looking at good, solid, artistic, cultural evidence to make this case. Now, what is an example of this in outside of this context that we could really drill this home? Well, you have actually Islam. Islam's really interesting because Islam has, I believe it has wonderful art. A lot of people give out to me about this. They're like, you're simping for Islam. But Islam has brilliant art, but Islam is interesting because their art is not human. They don't allow representation of people in their art. So their art is all abstract. It actually kind of looks like DMT trips when you check it out. It's like psychedelic. And it's impersonal. There's no human figures. Now, it's weirdly similar to the way Socrates began talking about regulating and moderating music. In Islam, you see exactly what happens. When you sterilize music or sterilize art, you actually see the instinct comes out, but in a really bizarre way. So it's an interesting phenomenon. Now, you contrast this with Western art, and at the very center of all of this Western art from our golden ages is the human physique, the body. This is almost like the instinctive art that comes out of the apex of man. We take ourselves and we become students of ourselves. This is what the Dionysian, barbaric, self-interested spirit wants to do. In the Greek age, they pick figures of their naked body and they lift them up as gods. In the Renaissance, they do the exact same thing. Through art, man worships himself as perfection. That's a Nietzsche quote. And this is precisely what we see happening. When we're firing in all cylinders, this is what we want to do. So you see this very profound difference between Islam, which sterilizes the human soul and the human figure and the human presence and turns it into something abstract. And it's like an ideological religion as a consequence. And it still produces stuff that is beautiful. Genius can work its magic, but it's not the same as what we achieve in the West. What we have in the West is different. And you could argue perhaps maybe it's different in a direction that really made mankind very effective, because out of this comes science, philosophy, all these type of things. So there's a different argument to be had there. Now, this is where the Christian argument becomes really fascinating, because again, you see the exact same phenomenon take place. You have all of these three, like, beautiful classical art, which is representational and has the human body in the center of it. This is what's there. This is classical art. When Christianity shows up, and people say, why is Nietzsche always bitching about Christianity? Here's actually a really fascinating take. When Christianity shows up, what does it immediately start to do? It starts to pull down all the statues. It starts to smash the Bible on the statues and say, we worship the book, just like Islam. We worship the book. We worship the words. We worship the intellect. It's like Socrates. We worship the intellectualism. We want to regulate art. The Christians were saying that these statues, these apex of human civilization up to that point. The Christians were calling them demons, saying they're possessed by demons. They were ripping their faces off, breaking their noses. They tore them all apart. And then what happens is you see the destruction of the classical world, the destruction of all these statues, the pulling of them down. And in its wake, what do you have with Christianity? You have these weird, autistic, spurgy, modern art type faces show up again. It's weird. It shows up again.
The eyes kind of look like the Koros.
They look goggly. It's really weird. You see that happen again. And what also happens, the Dark Ages come. That's a real, basically objective thing where you start to see, like you don't see statues like this anymore. Certainly not. None of that stuff shows up again until the Renaissance. You enter into the sort of cartoon era, which is quite bizarre. And there's even there's big, long debate and argument about iconoclasm. The Orthodox and the Catholics bicker about this quite a lot. What should we even have art in our work at all? Should we follow Socrates and get rid of art at all? Should we be like the Muslims? This becomes a huge thing where they're trying to sterilize Western art. So they essentially kill off the birth of tragedy and go through this whole new hyper-intellectualized period where you see art essentially die. And I like, kind of philosophy in a way dies as well. And they do different things, of course. And then, again, this is what's so crazy, is the Renaissance sees the exact same thing happen in the opposite direction. You have medieval cartoony art, which isn't so bad, but then it immediately rips back into three-dimensional representational art. And all of us, this is the birth of tragedy once again. The Renaissance shoves through the context of Christianity all of this old spirit once again. It achieves it again. And it happens again. And what happens during the Renaissance? You see the rise of humanism. You see the rise of, what does Leonardo da Vinci do? He digs up dead bodies and he studies the body. Once again, we're allowed to study the body. The church is saying, stop digging up dead bodies, you fucking lunatic. But Leonardo da Vinci is like, no. And what do we get out of his study of the body? He was doing it to try and make good statues. We get modern anatomy and the foundations of modern medicine. Man becomes the foundation of modern scientific study. We get materialism. We get natural philosophy. We get the return of the classical era. We get the foundations of science. And we have another golden age. It happens again. And all the same phenomenon begins to happen again. Out of this, we get operatic music. We get the new burst of music that comes in the centuries afterwards. It all takes place here, once again, because of the same Western spirit, it seems like. So if you were to say to yourself, what is the West? What is the point of Western culture? What is the goal with this? This could be it. This might be the objective thing. This is what we're trying to do. We're trying to go Renaissance mode. We're trying to go Athens mode. And you could see objectively, it seems like there's this countervailing force throughout history, which is where the barbarism and the autism split. And then we fall down into sort of a weird mix of both of them. We get like spurgy barbarism or something, the Dark Age, this type of thing. So this seems to be a thing. It seems to be something you can study. And you can argue maybe we're going through a fall right now with modern art. Who knows? But I've said a lot. I'll pass it over to Keegan or Lev or whatever's going on. There's some thoughts.
Well, before Keegan, I just want to ask Keegan as well, do you think that this is also an example of the tragedy, as it were? Because the tragedy ends up being that we try so hard to know ourselves through making these beautiful pieces of art, yet we end up over-intellectualizing, and it just keeps going on, and there's no avoiding it. I don't know.
One of the things that Nietzsche says is that in Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks, that philosophy has never once healed a sick people. It always makes them worse. But if it's begun by a healthy people, it makes them better. And so he says the Greeks began at the right time, but they didn't stop at the right time. And he sort of sees the philosophy in the tragic age, so the philosophers leading up to Socrates, as like a history of the symptoms of the effect of what was going on like a physiological level in the Greek society, something like that, the Greek culture. And so, well, I mean, I want to respond to something Steph said earlier, actually, before I lose the thought, because I've just been reading Tolstoy's essay, What is Art, for an upcoming episode. And one of the points that Tolstoy makes is that he talks about this regulation of art and the, as you mentioned in Islam, for example, and as you mentioned, having to do with iconoclasm. And one of the things that Tolstoy says, so he makes the point that he's sort of asking the question, why is it that certain forms of art are called bad and evil in different societies? And he says it all refers back to every society has, it's actually a very Nietzschean point, and I'm almost certain that Tolstoy never read Nietzsche, even though he was writing after Nietzsche had already died. But he said that, according to the values of the society, what they think is good in life and what they think is evil in life, that's what the religion's going to regulate for what is portrayed in their art, so to speak. And so he makes the point that the apostolic Christians of the first century, the only forms of art and artistic expression that they really allowed were the lives of the saints and the depictions of angels and stories from the biblical tradition and so on and so forth. And it was all incredibly minimal. And what Tolstoy says is that the resurgence during the Middle Ages and the return of sort of like this hierarchical church structure with these grandiose styles of architecture and their depictions of human figures and icons and so on and so forth is actually a resurgence of paganism, and that the repeated attempts at iconoclasm are really like the true spirit of Christianity sort of attempting to return. And that would have been, as Steph mentioned, the Renaissance. One of the things that Nietzsche often talks about is Martin Luther, and how he sees Martin Luther and the Reformation as a sort of it was the thing that tied off the veins of the revaluation of values that became possible with the Renaissance. And it's very interesting why that became possible in the Renaissance, because that ties back to Islam. You can draw a direct line from the Ottomans conquering Byzantium to the fact that all of these refugees are now spilling into the rest of Europe, and primarily into Italy, just going across the Adriatic Sea, and bringing with them texts and art and things that from the Greek world, texts that hadn't been translated into the Latin canon, basically. And so you had, a renewed interest in some of these old texts, and, works of Plato had never been translated until the Greeks brought them. People refugees from the Greek church bring them to Latin Christianity. And so then what do you have? In response to this, you have Martin Luther. And the interesting thing that Nietzsche says, that he agrees with Tolstoy, although they come to very different conclusions, that basically the point Nietzsche makes is, it was at the precise moment where life sat on the throne in the Vatican. And what does he mean by that? Well, in the Renaissance, the popes were sort of like mafia dons. They were like raising armies and having illegitimate children, and they were very concerned with worldly wealth and power and so on and so forth, and selling indulgences and all of these things that, we tend to look back on that now, and the narrative that we get is like, that was all very bad, and that's why the Reformation rose up. And Nietzsche has a sort of contrarian viewpoint that, in effect, again, as Tolstoy might have made the case with their art and their aesthetics, politically and socially, what was going on in the seat of Christianity at that time was effectively pagan, that it was effectively a return to the Greek celebration of earthly good and worldly good. And Luther and those autistic Germans, who are always on a quest to purify things, that's their MO, it's time to purify the religion, right? We need to get rid of all of these practices like indulgences, right? That, on the one hand, I completely understand the argument against indulgences, but on the other hand, there's a realism to it, right? The idea that we're all human and we're all going to sin, right? You might as well, it's like put a coin in the swear jar, right? Put a coin in the have an affair jar, is basically what it is. And like basically allowing for that, forgetting yourself, forgetting the rigidity of the moral code for a little bit. And so, but, one of the key things about what we see in the trends of the aesthetic of Protestantism, which doesn't happen immediately, but especially over time, the grandiose nature of the Protestant church, it's completely lost. To the fact where, like, let's look at the situation in America today. I spent a lot of time driving across this country. I've been in every state. I've seen all of this country. Most Baptist churches are like a shack in a field somewhere. They don't even have a steeple sometimes, because their attitude is basically like, hey, Jesus says in the New Testament, wherever 2 or 3 of you are gathered, there I am. You don't need to have a cathedral to have a church. We don't need to have all the robes and trappings and incense and all of these artwork and depictions. And in fact, the more that you focus your attention on those icons and that artwork and those depictions, the more that you are, frankly, being pagan. You're making graven images, right? You're attributing importance to these worldly things, beauty and displays of wealth and power and so on. And as a non-Christian myself, I'm not going to take a stand on that, but I will say it's a much more pleasant experience, an edifying experience, and even somewhat invigorating experience some way to attend a traditional Catholic Mass or go to an Orthodox church than it is to go to a plain, boring, aesthetically drab Baptist church.
Unless it's a Black Baptist church, but that's
sure. Or if it's a Pentecostal
other
church, then there's definitely some of the Dionysian in a Pentecostal church. I'm not fluent in tongues, but I speak a little bit. So, but yeah. So to bring it all back around, I guess I would say, there is something to that idea that the point that Nietzsche would basically make is that wherever you see that true art, what was going on is that you had, like Steph was saying, that union of Dionysus with Apollo, line and form and regularity and intellect and so on and so forth. And when you take that away, what you don't have the pure Apollonian, by the way. This is a very important point that Nietzsche makes. He calls it the Alexandrian age, but he says it's purely theoretical. Because Apollo is still a creative deity, and their thing of Dionysus and Apollo, they sort of contain something of one another. And when you take all of Apollo away, you don't get a pure Dionysian society. He calls it a Buddhistic society. It's just pure dissolution and self-forgetting. And so all the great works of art and aesthetics, Nietzsche thinks there is this unity there. And I don't know, it does seem like in those to bring it back to the late Roman statues as well, there is something deconstructionist about it, and something like meta and self-referential about it. And that's the thing about late Greece as well, the Hellenistic age. Very few works of art are produced during that time, of literature or poetry, that we actually remember. The major works are scientific or they're encyclopedic. They're like categorizing what went before.
Wow. God, I didn't know that. That's mad. That was like after Alexander, they had this huge territory. That's crazy. Right. So they have this huge territory, but they don't produce more art. They just sort of copy what came from Athens, and then you just see encyclopedias and stuff. Wow, that's interesting.
It's like all the cultural capital existed beforehand, and they're all the works of art are referencing. They're using the language of, it's like memeing in a way. Mm-hmm. All the memes are referring to things that were created at an earlier time.
Wow.
But what do you guys make out of this Greek type of a style that was within the Byzantine world of Christendom here? Because they all have the same kind of thick eyebrows. They look kind of angry all the time. What exactly was this mood that the people were in at the time? Oh, here's a work from... Yeah.
Lev, I actually like to talk about Protestantism a little bit more from Keegan, but I do like an awful lot of Orthodox art. It's kind of like with the Muslims. There's an interesting phenomenon here because it's easy to like bash them and be like they banned art and all this, but that's not actually what happens. What happens is you restrict art in a way, and the creative genius still expresses itself, but it does it within very, very defined limitations. So it actually has this effect of like making interesting stuff, like Muslim sort of like psychedelic mosque art on the roofs. It's actually very beautiful. It's very unique, but it's this really weird feeling of absence of human figures. That's a very strange feeling about all Muslim art. Muhammad, you can't draw pictures of him as well. It's just a strange phenomenon. And you wonder, is like the most natural way of making art the Western way, which is like you perfect nature and you perfect your instincts and you get physical representations of yourself, versus like this sort of like autistic psychedelic art or something. That's the same with the Orthodox. The Orthodox have like these very, very clear restrictions, but it leads to a very fertile style of art over time, which is quite cool. But the Protestants yes. are a fascinating one because, again, like we talk about these motifs where we have the birth of tragedy, the Athenian Golden Age, and then that comes to its close and you see Socrates show up, and Socrates is self-referential, over-intellectualized, Apollonian, separated from the instincts. And he almost like sterilized. He becomes a cultural critic. He becomes a Frankfurt School deconstructionist, and he's like shearing apart the thing that came before him. And it essentially acts as this like stultifying force that overthinks and overreasons, drives things in. So the Christians do the same thing to Rome. The Christians show up, they pull down the statues, they start to bash the book in people's face. They demand a hardcore moralism. They kill off all the pagan rituals. They attack ritualistic thinking. They do this sort of culture of critique where they're like, what is going on with the pagan rituals? And it all falls down. It all like collapses in this way. Protestants do the same thing. You're absolutely correct. The Catholics were very instinctive. You know, they're going in and the Pope has 5 girlfriends. And it's like, yeah, but sure, like he's the Pope, you know. And then you go into church and you go through the motions. The rituals of life are very strong. Now, it's fascinating because when you think about what a religion is in its essence, that's actually the most important part, is that the rituals of life function. You think about how people do religion on the internet, reactionary religion people on the internet now. They're trying to redeem Christianity. They're trying to redeem religion. They're trying to redeem maybe paganism. But it's all very intellectual. But you think about like what actually people want out of religion, what they're trying to sell you is that you go to the church, you'll get a girlfriend, you'll have kids, you'll form a family, and you have a community. That's just, none of that stuff's intellectual at all. That's just like functional, normal rituals of life from all of history. You don't even have to think about, you could be a Hindu, you could be a Muslim, you could be a Catholic, and you get that and you'll be a happy guy. And you like the decoration, the intellectual decoration on top of that doesn't really make that much of a difference. So the rituals of life seem to be very prominent. And in Catholicism, you see almost like it becomes kind of pagan in that it just focuses on the Dionysian rituals of life and making sure that they're firing in all cylinders. Protestantism comes in and it does all these really crazy things. It demands a cessation of those rituals and a rethinking of what's going on. They literally started to scratch out images, faces of Christian art and write biblical passages over them. It was the destruction of the image and the physique and the form in preference of the word, of the category, of the encyclopedic knowledge. That was the conquest. Obviously, Martin Luther did this by stamping his theses onto the doors and all this. And there was the destruction, like the getting rid of all the angels, the getting rid of all the irrationality. All of this stuff was cast out, the Puritanism. And it led to this huge, like just cleaving out of the Renaissance movement in many ways. And it really shook Christianity. Christianity actually had to react and become more autistic in order to like compete with the Protestants. They were like, yeah, you're right. The Pope having 7 girlfriends is like a bit much. Like we get it, this type of thing. So like there is this like this enforcement of this Apollonian autism that actually like kills off the vibe. It's like, you know, you set up a scene. And then it's going really well, and nobody really knows while it's functioning. And then some guy comes in, the music critic shows up, and he starts to explain everything, and you're like, he killed it, man. He made it uncool, this type of thing. That's sort of what the phenomenon that seems to be happening. So this is a massive cultural trend you see over and over again, and something that you see nowadays. Lev, maybe if you could share. Or I don't know. I'll share for a second.
Sure. And by the way, real quick, this is St. Peter's Basilica over here. Speaking of autism, this was done during the Counter Reformation. So the Catholics wanted to show, you know, like even more of the kind of stuff that people wanted to see from them visually as well. So the Dionysian and Apollonian combo, it wasn't over yet, but here we go.
So this is an example of what people would call pastiche art. So this is like a very talented, like this is an Asian lady. She's very, very skilled. And she's making kind of Western style. She kind of looks like she's making a Western woman, you know. And it's really talented and really skilled, but it's not quite right. Like you look at this and you know it's a little bit pastiche. It's not the same as the heroic art of like these like glorious physiques. For some reason, it just doesn't look right. And there's a really funny exchange where I think it's Rollo Tomasi. So he's like the red pill guy. And this is published on Twitter, and it's only published half. So you can only see the statue. And Rollo's doing this big lilt about like, this is what Western man creates. This is what men can create at their peak. And then someone just comments underneath and is like, you fucking Egypt. This is an Asian woman who made this, you know? And it is this funny thing where like we can feed you almost like a slop is kind of strong, but you know, we can feed you like a pastiche version of the Renaissance. And people will kind of be happy, but it's not really doing the job. It's the same way as that the Romans towards the end were trying to make this Roman art, this classical art, but they had lost something. The spirit was gone. And it was almost like they were filling the molds now, but there was no soul inside of it. So this is not the same as Michelangelo's David, and it won't live as long at all. But it's still kind of weirdly good. It's hard to describe. So it seems like there's something like the spirit or the soul, the Dionysian soul dies. And that happens over and over in history. And in some sense, that's what you're fighting to redeem. You're fighting to somehow create that and then maybe try to preserve it and then resist these other forces. Or maybe you can't. Maybe you just have to let these cycles happen and just be aware when they're going on and these type of things and not get in the way of it. So it's, there's a lot of fascinating things in this front.
I don't want to dwell too much on the D-man, Donald Trump here, but what you were just telling me right now about this pastiche art does kind of remind me a bit of the crassness and tastelessness, the over-ostentatiousness of Trump and his movement, right? You know, I mean, there is something about that.
People get mad at me. Like, I find Trump funny. You know, I like Trump, but it's almost like he kind of does seem like a sort of parody of like a American capital. Like he only eats McDonald's. He lives in like a gold-plated New York apartment. And then like if you look at the old WASPs, like Trump is obviously a WASP, but you look at the old WASPs and they're in country clubs and they seem like they're a little bit different. They're more like demure and they kind of like have a different aura about them or something like this. So I do actually notice that a little bit. And as an outsider, I originally Trump was just quintessential American man, but as you kind of get to know America a bit more, you start to understand it's like the old guard, and Trump's like almost maybe like a pastiche version of it or something. It's weird.
If you wrote him as a fictional character, no one would believe. They would say it was totally unbelievable.
He is a fictional character, just like his name being Trump and all that. But Trump does not this go into what I was saying in the very beginning, that Nietzsche quote? Trump is in a way living art. He is humanity being created as this artwork of everything coming together. All these, these young Zoomers with the Roman bust avatars, and you have the cat boy Nick Fuentes, and you have Trump in his golden building. It's like it all, and his giant, Nephilim son. Like it all does paint a picture that just like observing it as both an audience member and participator, depending on how much you want to participate in this play. Like, was that what was going on in ancient Greece with these choruses when they had the tragic plays? Were the people there not like also participating in it and also being the audience? You guys tell me.
Well, I mean, okay, like to some extent, you could say he was memed into office. And that is very much a participation of, the audience, and very much like an aesthetic. I mean, I would say that the aesthetics are almost more important than the substance when it comes to like the Trump movement at this point. And there is something about that, the whole Greek statue or avatar, and then even just like the old Americana like imagery and all of this. That is, how would I put it? It does strike me as being similar to the sort of late Roman, like, or like what you were talking about with this like newer attempts at like pastiche, where it's grasping at an old aesthetic. And I think that there is something about it that is kind of sad that we, like, for one, as far as like Nietzsche's philosophy, what interests me about it is that it's a philosophy of the future. And that what Nietzsche was very excited about with Wagner was that he said this would be the music of the future. And so obviously Nietzsche is very concerned with the past, with the ancient Greeks, and with understanding the essence of the Greek culture. But part of why he wants to understand that is in order to create it anew, and that the Dionysian will not arrive in the same form, wearing the same masks, wearing the same persona and the same narratives and stories. That what really interested Nietzsche about Wagner was precisely what was new about his art, right? Was the fact that he had this Gesamtkunstwerk where the totality of the music and the drama and the characters and the scene and everything comes together. And, Wagner doesn't use repeating passages of verse and chorus. Everything is this like sort of grand construction that all builds and builds and builds. And he has these leitmotifs that come in and out, and he uses unorthodox instruments. Like part of the score is like 20 anvils during the ring cycle, and you can hear like Sleipnir's hooves beating at certain points, right? And these are things that no one ever had done before. And he had to construct new opera houses that needed to be bigger so that he could do even bigger performances, and so on and so forth. And so I think that, part of just aesthetically, I feel like the whole cultural movements that we're in right now, from any side that I see them, are usually trapped in the past. And they're usually, I find that that's the case with our political debates, our moral debates. We're still talking about things from the 20th century and the 19th century. I mean, here we are talking about Nietzsche and all of this. But I think the real value of Nietzsche is precisely in looking to the past as a contrast. And that's the great power of Dionysus versus the crucified, or the master versus the slave morality, or Christianity versus paganism. Nietzsche raises these irreconcilable differences, but there's something that's revealed about a phenomenon that you only see when you see those irreconcilable differences, when you see what is antipodal to it and what is the opposite of it. And much of Nietzsche's project is showing, okay, we have been poisoned by 2,000 years of Christianity in Nietzsche's view. It's so ingrained in the way that we think. I'm going to show you something that is outside of that. That's actually antithetical to that. It's not antithetical. Greek paganism isn't antithetical to Christianity because it was making war on Christianity. Christianity didn't even exist yet. It's antithetical to it because Christianity arose in opposition to it. And so by showing you that in full relief, we can see the true character of the modern world in Nietzsche's view. And so then what do you do with that knowledge, right? I think if your response to it is to say, well, then we need to bring back those Greek statues and go back to that. I think Nietzsche wouldn't have much respect for that attitude. He would say, take that same vital fire that gave rise to that and figure out what the artwork of the future is going to be. And we have had some examples of the Dionysian coming up. I mean, I think me and Steph talked about it the last time I was on his show. Music in the 1960s and 70s in America, many people would say, had like a Dionysian element. I still see some of that in the heavy metal community today. But it's, how would I put it? It's like maybe a small percentage of how Dionysian things were in ancient Greece, right? People don't really get a chance to go out of their minds and totally forget themselves and go into ecstasy or frenzy today.
Visually, though, I'm curious, like, where do you think we can go visually? Because musically, sure, but visually, are you able to top the kind of form that Steph was talking about with these ancient Greeks?
Well,
if your attitude is that you can't, then you won't.
Based. Keegan, you finished? I was gonna
Sure.
All right, a tirade on this because like a really excellent point. Excellent point. This is actually a critical point that Nietzsche would be very mad if you did not understand. The type of stuff where you'd be like, Nietzsche, listen, this is all the stuff we've done. You bring him back to life, a time travel machine. Look at what we've done. He'd be like, no, you idiots, you read it wrong. He'd be all disappointed. It's the spirit. It's almost like he's trying to get you to notice the phenomenon and separate it out of ideology, out of time and place, all of that stuff. He's trying to get you to notice the spirit, the birth of tragedy out of the spirit of music, I guess you could call it. Because what are we describing here? Like, I'm not saying Greek statues are the be all and end all. There's something underneath that. I was saying to you, for example, that there's this weird set of phenomenon that oscillate around Greek statues and oscillate around the Renaissance. Like literally in the Renaissance, you have Da Vinci studying the anatomy, studying the body. You have humanism. You have the rise of Michelangelo's David, the perfection of the body in stone. So it seems like there's a man is the measure of all things becomes this philosophical trope of the time. So there's this like centered nature on the subject and the perfection of the subject, the perfection of the perfect representation of you in all your glory. You are like, this is the view that they had of God at the time. God created you and you are made of the mathematics of the golden gold. This is why you see Vitruvian Man. You're the center of the story. There's something in you that's quite magical. It's the same way as we look at AI art now. And why is AI art so screwed up? It seems like because there's something sort of anti-human about it. And this is what really gets people upset about it. There's something that's deeply offensive to our spirit. And slop AI, like this is sort of what it looks like it's going to do, is generate a bazillion iterations of kind of like pastiche art, but there will be no soul inside of it. So there is this thing that we're aware of. In ancient Greece, it was the same thing. Philosophical materialism, the logos, the conception of this, all this rises up. Tragedy, this type of thing. And then the countervailing force is the Christian force. And Nietzsche's pointing out that like when Christianity comes into Rome and eviscerates the classical world, it's not like a trivial thing. They destroy it. They create a total cultural wasteland. They drive everything hard into the ground. It's just ruins things. It's similar to what Keegan was saying about the Hellenic Age, that like the Hellenic Age does bring Greek culture, but it finds it very hard to iterate on Greek culture. So there's like a sterilization act that happens. And that's almost like the opposite force. It kills the soul. And it doesn't give you this sort of idea that you can go and try perfect yourself. It doesn't give you this concept of the Superman, the Ubermensch. You don't go and take mankind as the subject and try to craft him into his most perfect form, which is what they were doing. They weren't creating statues. They were trying to capture gods inside statues. They were trying to capture the perfect image. They were ideals. It's all wrapped up in this thing. And Christianity is it's anti-idealistic. It says Christ is the final concept of man, and it's about admitting that you must submit. You cannot go higher. You are not special. You were broken. You might have to like go into the brokenness. And like great.
And it's a hatred of life too, right?
Well, yeah, you could argue that hatred is essentially of excellence. You could make that argument. Now, again, the Christianity is more complicated than that, but this is this sort of idea. Again, you look at Islam, take it out of the Christian context. Islam kind of does the same thing. It's like anti-human in a weird way. It's anti the soul. It takes mankind out of the picture and it sterilizes the cultural place. And it does seem to have this effect where it leads to a cultural wasteland if you're not careful. It's actually a really, really dangerous thing. And what is that phenomenon? What is going on? That's really interesting. And then this countervailing force doesn't mean it can't happen in Christianity or maybe even Islam. The Renaissance happens in a Christian context, but the spirit, the pagan spirit, maybe as we could call it. But I think this is beyond something as simple as Christian versus pagan. Mm-hmm. It's like the full 3D, full spectrum spirit of mankind punches through in the West, in the Renaissance. And it has this explosion of all this genius in a golden age once again. And it's very volatile. And we get out of that alchemy, science, medicine. This is obviously where we get physics redeems again, modern art. Like the 19th century is where like an awful lot of these beautiful buildings were built in Europe. And they were all finalizing and perfecting what was discovered 400 years before in the Renaissance. It's a similar sort of civilizational arc. And then what comes now is this sort of moralized, almost Abrahamic-like era of modernity, which is sterilizing everything, which is killing everything off, and it's very, very dangerous. And you even see this within like the arcs of like just many things within culture and all this. So it seems like there's this spirit. It's not definable, and it's about really centering our concept of what we're trying to redeem on ourselves. And maybe the way this is going to hit us in the face is going to be us dealing with artificial intelligence. AI is going to give us this incredible generative capacity. And if we're not using our souls to craft this, like maybe a sort of AI and man married situation, it's just going to turn into like a desolation. Imagine, all right, think of it this way. Imagine if like the heavy moralism of the last 10 years won, and we had highly regulated, almost like Orwellian censorship-orientated AI dominating everything. That's what that would have turned into. You wouldn't even be able to express your thoughts using AI because it would have been so freaky. Now, maybe we have this opportunity where people like Musk, whether you like him or not, have sort of opened up the gates and said, you can try stuff with this. And now the danger is that will turn into slop in its own way. Because, these guys aren't it's like super sophisticated. So maybe this is what we're wrestling to try do in our era is like win the human spirit back. Maybe we need to just blow up all the data centers and be like, no, you just have to make stuff yourself or something like this. But like that's the sort of like challenge that's at your feet, is that it's the human-centric question.
And just a quick point about Islam. What's very interesting is that, like the culture wars that we have like in the West that the Christians oppose is like the modern art and stuff like that. But when like ISIS took over regions in like Central Asia, they're like blowing up like Buddha statues in like Afghanistan and like destroying like Assyrian like bas-reliefs and things like that. Which is, in some cases predates this golden era of Athens, right? That any sort of graven representational image, even going back, it's like a war on human heritage, right? In some sense, that there's no concept at all that any of that is positive, that any of that leads towards anything. And then what was another point you were making? Oh, about science. The other interesting thing that Nietzsche says in his lectures on so Nietzsche calls them pre-Platonic philosophers because he says Socrates is more similar to the other pre-Socratics than Plato is to Socrates. Probably take us too far afield, but in the lectures on the pre-Platonics, in Nietzsche's notes for those lectures, he basically lays out how each of the pre-Platonic philosophers advances a theory of natural philosophy, science, that it runs parallel to what was happening in Europe during the Age of Reason and the Enlightenment. Like, so he compares Thales to like Lavoisier, and he's comparing Democritus at the end of that process to like Rogerio Boskovic, who's like a physicist from Croatia, who is a very important influence on Nietzsche, actually. He comes up with this idea of force point particles instead of atoms, and believes that basically everything can be rendered in a single equation of a single force acting at different distances. And that's very similar to Nietzsche, sort of produces a philosophical version of that in Will to Power. But the point is, he sees, just as Steph has been talking about this whole time, of all of the trends of art returning in the Renaissance, he sees like quite a literal repetition of the progression of these scientific figures and their discoveries with the worldviews that were going on and being promoted by the pre-Socratic philosophers.
It's like, this is such an interesting point as well to really extrapolate this out, because if you're like, I don't know, if you agree with the thesis I'm shunting here, because I think this is kind of a crystallized version of like a couple of different things. Nietzsche doesn't exactly say what I'm saying, definitely not with all like the examples. A lot of this I got from like E. McGilchrist, and you start to run into this very interesting idea that mankind, as we evolved, struggled out of the jungle. We struggled in this barbaric Dionysian state. And the Greeks were Nietzsche calls them the first event in culture. So they were this like flickering, and something big happens there. Huge happens there, because Costin Alamaro, he writes Selective Breeding and the Birth of Philosophy, and he's speaking about his idea of what happens here as well, which is like the Greeks become self-aware of nature. This is the kind of foundation of his thesis. So in the barbaric world of the Indo-European steppe, they're breeding horses, and they naturally conclude, they don't even think about it. They're like, we breed horses, make strong horse. We breed man, we make strong man. That's how good breed man, strong man get big, tall, we become strong. So they naturally do. You could call it eugenics. Now, his idea, Costin's idea, is that what happens then is the ancient Greeks create civilization, and they're all looking around and they're being like, they start to think about this, and they're like, we've pulled ourselves out of nature. We've separated from nature. We're not like we were in the steppe, in the open field anymore. And that could be bad. We could get weak if we're not careful. And so they start to think, man, maybe we need to breed ourselves, be stronger, like Sparta or something like this type of thing. And so they start to become conscious of this abstraction, which they call thesis, nature, physics. And this is a big deal, because that's the awareness of nature as a thing. That's a huge deal. I don't think people understand how big of a deal this is. Why is it a big deal? Because the Greeks and all this, they're thinking, what is nature? What is this? What is reality? What is nature? What is physics? How do we manipulate it? What are its laws? And there's this birth of tragedy. And then out of this, we also, at the same time as that, we get high drama, advanced statues, this weird spiritual thing where we properly represent ourselves for the first time ever. It's like we're looking at ourselves in the mirror and recognize ourselves for the first time ever. It's a big deal. It's a really big deal. Never has that happened before. First time we're making ourselves as we are, and the first time we're also idealizing ourselves. The Olympics come, we're in perfecting our physiques. Essentially, bodybuilding starts, competition starts, sports competition starts. All these profound things take place. And it sets up this predicate that if we engage with reality as it is, physics, nature, if we engage with it properly, this huge burst of things comes out. I think Costin, for example, kind of reduces it to just eugenics, and for this reason misses an awful lot of this stuff as an accident when he's trying to reassert a taboo foundation, which he's correct about in our modern society. But the point is that all of this happens as one, and they're all sort of married together. And then what is the progression then? So you look at the Renaissance, and this is the thing you'll notice, is that the Renaissance is the second iteration of this. We get pulled into Abrahamic Christianity, and we lose it all. And we get pulled back down into barbarism again. And then we have to rediscover it. But we discover it the second time. And the second time we do it even better. Now, this is a very interesting idea. The second time is not, we don't just make Greek statues. The second time advances alchemy. We take alchemy, and all of a sudden we're doing like basic chemistry. Like from basic chemistry, by the time we figured out dynamite, which is like a chemical equation, chemical string of processes, we had nuclear weapons within 60 years. Like, it's insane how fast this stuff happens. So there was serious progress taking place. The Renaissance, you look at all the statues in the Renaissance, they are better than the Greeks. They are way better than the Greeks. Michelangelo's David is an achievement beyond anything the Greeks pulled off. And it is so beautiful. There's an advancement that takes place. The like anatomy that Da Vinci was doing, the advancement of the philosophy, the moral advancement of the philosophy is more sophisticated because Christianity had taught them about the conscience and about the mind a bit better. So there is this huge set of step forwards that happened. And this lays the foundation of science. So the first time around, physics and nature and natural philosophy, went so far. But this time around, we start to really penetrate in. And we start to say, like, what are the laws of physics? How can we use them? How can we bend them? We get chemistry, we get physics, we get astronomy. As I said, we're by the time this cycle has ended, we have the power to destroy the world. We have the power to eviscerate. We're shooting rockets into outer space. The first time Western culture went beyond Rome is when we applied physics correctly and we started to do the Industrial Revolution. That's when it happened. Because of this burst of physical knowledge brought us to this advancement. And so you start to see that every time we get this flicker, there's an advancement. Islam never pulled that off. The Christian medieval ages did not pull this off. It just didn't happen. It was these paradigm shifts when we pulled this off with these periods. This is when, like, you literally just like shoot mankind into new paradigms. And so you can sort of say is that if that spirit arrives again, like 1,000 things will happen at once that will blast us into a new paradigm. Is it still here right now? Like, you look at modern physics and you look at what's going on, maybe it's here. Maybe we're in the brink of losing it. Maybe we could bend things in a certain way to make sure it happens and continue to blast ourselves forward. Maybe this is the point of humanity. Humanity labored through evolution and labored through the barbarism of the jungle. And these flickers have happened unconsciously. And this is sort of like Nietzsche's prophecy. It's happened by happy accident. Maybe we could actually be intentional about it for once and form a reevaluation of what we're doing and actually get it right and just like have a real blister forward and almost like achieve a real enlightenment that would change things. So there's an interesting thesis in there. It's implicate. Like, you obviously have to stretch it out a little bit, but it seems like it's there. And what we're doing in modernity is like certainly like pointing to us that it's almost like begging to get revealed, if you so will.
I have a question for you guys. Do you think that this paradigm that we were seeing in the Renaissance was also partly due to wanting to give a nice middle finger to Christianity? So in a way we could say, like, we owe it to Christianity to inflame a lot of the people back then into going beyond this very stale, rigid type of culture that set in. So in a way, maybe we could say that Christianity and a lot of these, descending movements were the pressure cooker, which, by the time that people have had enough of this, now they're finally ready to unleash a much better and greater kind of art than has come before. And do you think that that is also why, for example, with the founding fathers of the United States, they came from the stock of people who were, very pietous, all these pilgrims, yet we would not be able to say that Benjamin Franklin and people like that were anything close to the pilgrims as far as, this kind of, very sober piety. And would you say the same thing could apply to today when we have a lot of these very empty-headed, nostalgic boomers, with the MAGA hats, and also these Zoomers that are just like robot people by this point, who are just stuck on their iPads all the time. Is that also a kind of pressure that maybe like a few people that are observing it are like freaking out, like, oh my God, like these people are going to destroy the world? That's going to enable yet another greater step to follow. So what do you guys think?
Yeah, I'll let Keegan go. I won't say too much, but yeah, you got to be wary. Again, that whole idea of like cultural desolation. You have the Abrahamic Revolution in Rome. Like that's fairly permanent for about 1,000 years. It's not something you figure out. So like if the phones and AI got to a point where you had like full addiction combined with full censorship, I think it'd be like, mankind would be finished for a cycle, and you'd wait to what comes next, this type of thing. So it's brutal. But Keegan, sorry.
Oh, well, yeah, I mean, so in the preface to Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche describes it, you called it a pressure cooker, but Nietzsche describes it as the tension of the bowstring. And he talks about how to astrology and other superstitious belief systems, we owe the grand style of building in Egypt. Like the Great Pyramids are constructed based on erroneous beliefs that are, from Nietzsche's perspective, I mean, they're metaphysical, they're moral, they're, I mean, I guess I insert that caveat because there are people who believe in the afterlife even today, right?
Who
would say
that shade at astrologers as well. All the girls would be
well, I believe in astrology, but in a very peculiar way, which I won't get into. But in any case, Carl Jung makes some very persuasive arguments about astrology and about alchemy as well. But in any case, I think that, so the tension of the bowstring, right? And Nietzsche says he doesn't want to unbend the bowstring, and that there have been many attempts to do so. One was means of Jesuitism. Well, Jesuitism is part of the Counter-Reformation, the attempt to basically end this conflict between the purifying German autistic Protestant side and the Catholic sort of, I don't know what you would say, the more we've been calling it more instinctive, the more grandiose, the more paying homage to what is human, or giving due to what is human in the church, right? And what Nietzsche would basically allege was paganism in a Christian form. And other people have recognized this too. I mean, I mentioned Tolstoy. Rene Girard would be somebody else who would say that we never fully depaganized. And so Nietzsche would say this is productive tension. What is that? Drawing taut the bowstring allows you to shoot for a farther goal. And as Steph points out, that could even be 1,000 years. It could be, I mean, Nietzsche would say, we've waited for 2,000 years of Christianity to reap this now. And what's very interesting about the founding fathers that you bring that up, I mean, many of them were part of secret societies and held Rosicrucian beliefs and deistic beliefs and Masonic beliefs. And, I don't actually know. I mean, a lot of people will attribute, they'll attribute traditional Christian values to the founding of America. But I mean, I certainly wouldn't say they were like modern progressive values, but the ideas that they had in many ways were very counter to traditional, very much, how would you say? I mean, very much based on the most recent philosophical ideas of the time and the most recent, theories towards like running a state and found what it takes to found a state and to establish, the entire premise of the Constitution, right? And the idea that we're going to have a document that is like the anchor of the society. In some ways, that's very Christian, right? It's the word, right, as the basis rather than any one human being. But what does the document do? I mean, it establishes like this separation of powers. It establishes like this limited government in many ways. It entrusts things to the people. Not the people. I mean, obviously, at the time of the framing of the Constitution, they had a very different conception of what the people was than we have it today. But,
oh dear.
Well, I mean, in terms of the fact that for one, it's landowners, right? You have to be a property owner to have any. That's when they're talking about the people will decide. They don't mean like everyone. It's and then not to mention that they were, exterminating Native Americans and enslaving people and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
But they in a way that the founding fathers they produced a very aristocratic document. And that's actually a very interesting critique that somebody like Michael Parenti, who's a Stalinist, would make of the U.S. Constitution, is that it's very similar to the way that the Republic was set up in ancient Rome, is not actually democratic or Republican in the sense that we would think of it today. And that, in some sense, that was the threat posed by Caesar, was the fact that not that he challenged democratic norms, but that he posed a threat to an oligarchy. All of that is to say, the views of the founding fathers very much, I would say, come out of the Enlightenment, come out of the Age of Reason, come out of this, you could trace it all the way back to like the New Atlantis scientists, Francis Bacon, that whole notion,
AKA William Shakespeare, AKA the writer of the King James Bible, allegedly.
Right. Yeah. So, and that's my point in sort of bringing that up is that whatever you think of America at its founding or America today, there's some kind of pagan about using pagan in a broad extended sense here, as we've been talking about, like the full thrust of the human experience and many of those ideas about, that come out of the Age of Reason. And
I want to quickly counter before Steph, while we're talking about the founding fathers and the pagans here. If you imagine, like, I was walking past this sign, I'm in this nice part in Long Island here, and they still have those classic signs with like a picture of a pilgrim on it with the hat. And I'm thinking, like, yes, I know that they're trying to be, subtle and sober, but that is a really kick-ass outfit, like the pilgrim outfit. You have the belt, the shiny belt, the hat with another belt on it. You know what I mean? Like, there is something of, I want to be as close to a god as I can. Sure, I'm going to work within these particular limits of my faith, but do you guys think that even there you had some expression of men wanting to be moral for the sake of acquiring even more power, as opposed to this kind of more like sensitive type of, we should give to the poor, and I want I want everything to end. It's like, no, I am going to acquire the power of God himself by emulating Jesus.
Well, you see this this is actually like a very common thing. It's a pretty good call out to shall we say ideological promoters in general, because you see in ancient, during the Renaissance, what are all these guys up to? The popes are all having orgies. There's one pope, it might be a Borgia, where he gets his son and they literally have an orgy with his son, and they just get a load of chicks in.
A Borgia orgia. But then, like, you look at the Protestants, the second the Protestants had power, like the Anabaptists literally took over a city in Germany. And while they were under siege, they set up polyamory laws, and like the guy leading it just basically had like multiple young wives. You have Joseph Smith over in America, and he creates this like very fertile, energetic young Christian Mormon church, and he reinterprets the Bible with his conscience. There's so much I could go into with that, by the way. But that's like, you can have multiple wives and this type of thing. So it's really like, the energy makes its way, the spirit makes its way through no matter the ideological face, which is kind of this point where some people get a bit of a hate boner for Christianity when they're talking about Nietzsche, but like the Renaissance happened in a Christian context. The spirit can muscle its way through anything. Literally anything. There's no ideology. It could take Islam and turn it into something if it wanted to. It could take atheism and turn it into something if it wanted to. And like an awful lot of the people just misunderstand what the force is that they're supposed to be centering on. They want the ideology. It's like the Socratic Spurg autism. They don't want the words, but they don't want the spirit. And it's like, all right, well, you'll get nothing then as a consequence. And again, another thing to even iterate into this, because like Keegan was talking about he's talking about the founding fathers, and their inspiration. And it's like those guys were LARPing as Romans. And even the whole concept of democracy. Where does the concept of democracy come from? It comes from Athens. Demos Kratos.
During the Golden Age. Because what was happening is they had Socrates, and they had these playwrights, and they had these genius statue carvers. And they said, these guys are all like 4 million IQ. These individuals are all nuts. None of them are see the world the same way. We're literally living through a golden age of about 40,000 insane supermen. We can't have a king. we need to, and then obviously the army functions as like a phalanx where everybody is equal. So what we're going to do is we're going to try this thing where each individual gets this perspective, and we'll try this like broad perspectivism, this type of thing. So the whole foundation of democratic, free citizenship representation is this pagan, individualistic, humanistic spirit. That's what it is. It's not Christian. The Christian era was the era of kings. It wasn't democratic. This is just this is like how the conservatives are so anti-intellectual. They're like, it's an idiot parade where they're saying stuff like Christ is a representation of like the free will, to free speech, to vote in a democratic system. It's like, that's Roman and Greek. That comes from this pagan spirit that we're speaking about, or or whatever you want to call it. So there's huge problems with this type of stuff. And actually, in a weird way, one of the best arguments for democracy is specifically what I'm saying here, where during these golden ages, they happen in democratic republics. The republics in Italy, they're like small city states that are controlled by either like princes or kings or the church or the republics are going on. Then ancient Greece is the same thing. So it's like actually a vote in favor of that, and saying that this is where when individualism is bursting in its true sense, not the ideological sense that conservatives try to sell you so that you buy into their nonsense. Instead, it's like actual individualism. Because you're dealing with like a roster of geniuses. It's almost like something like democracy or republicanism is like predicate. You have to do it, this type of thing. And which actually brings me, Keegan had a great thing on Jordan Peterson. I'd love to maybe ask him about that in a second, but I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I would say that in terms of, you could almost make the argument that Christianity is by its very nature somewhat apolitical or even anarchistic. I mean, if you look at, you just mentioned Jordan, one of his favorite lines that he loves to quote of Nietzsche, there was only one Christian and he died on the cross. What does Nietzsche mean by that? Well, he means that to Jesus, the kingdom of heaven is an imminent thing, that Jesus denies the world. He literally denies the reality of the world. And that, there are multiple passages where he says, it's harder for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven than to thread a camel through the eye of the needle. Take no thought for the morrow, for God shall take care of all things. Sell everything you have and follow me. These statements are, there were early sects in the apostolic age of Christianity that took this very, very seriously. People will say, well, that's not practical, but it's totally is practicable. You could totally sell everything you have and live as a wandering ascetic, or live in a commune, or go join the monastery, and lots of people have, right? But an interesting thing Nietzsche says about anarchism is that it always ends up producing the most egregious tyrannies, because what ends up happening is, as you point out in Christianity, or in the Christian age of the Middle Ages, what do we get? We get these like autocratic kingships and feudal systems. And what is that based on? Well, it's based on divine right of kings. It's based on the idea that the world as it is of the devil, and that you will never have any sort of political system that will actually approximate the kingdom of heaven. Your way into the kingdom of heaven is within you, or it's after death. That's when all accounts are settled and everything is rectified. And so in the meantime, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. Right. And so there, you could really see Christianity, you could make an argument that in its purest form, it really is like a sort of, it's why Nietzsche would call it like a herd religion. You basically render unto Caesar, and what you're concerned with is your soul. You're not concerned with reforming the system or revolution or anything of the sort, really. And so I think, that's a long-winded way of saying I agree. I agree that democratic Republican systems, or that end up being, I would say, ultimately oligarchic, are not really Christian in form, because there's something about them. One of the ways that Nietzsche talks about it is he says that the Greeks abhorred autocracy, and they abhorred any situation in which the agon would cease, the competition, the social competition between Greeks. So all of the greatest artists, like the greatest sculptors, are in competition with one another. Pindar and Simonides are writing verses, and Nietzsche says they're doing it out of jealousy. They're doing it out of envy. I am going to write a better verse than him. And he says artists in the modern age have a real problem with this. We don't like to admit and I'm an artist myself, so I know this. Musicians don't like to admit when they're driven by envy for what someone else is doing. We think that like corrupts the art, or it's like a less pure thing. What Nietzsche says is that's the only thing that redeemed art in the eyes of the Greek, because they saw art as something shameful, just because you're actually being taken over by a muse, which means you're being made to labor on behalf of a god, which means you're their slave. And so, and he says they would have reverence. Yeah, they would have reverence for the work they produced. What he compares it to is, he says, a Greek sculptor makes this beautiful statue and he'll be proud of it, sort of in the same way, but ashamed of the process of making it, sort of in the same way that the Christian is proud of their child, but ashamed of the act of sex.
Oh my God.
So the one thing that redeems being an artist in that station in life is that you're part of this competition for greatness. And so, and the other interesting claim that Nietzsche makes about this is about ostracism, the practice where every year the polis votes to expel one person. And what Nietzsche says is that originally this had nothing to do with like removing problematic people or tyrants or something like that. What they would often banish would be like the best person at a given art or craft. And the reason behind that is, if Magnus Carlsen is world champion every single year, then the chess world championship is boring. Then when Magnus Carlsen leaves and says, I'm not going to compete, suddenly we don't know who's going to win. And there have been some exciting championships since that happened. Nietzsche basically says that's why they did ostracism, was so that the competition can keep going. So there's this kind of idea in Nietzsche that it's like a critical mass of geniuses. You actually want there to be multiple geniuses and no winner. You don't want anyone to win for too long and just dominate everything, because this like process of envy and jealousy towards one another will drive these geniuses like Paul McCartney and John Lennon to write better singles than the other one wrote, and so there is something about that structure, that like multiplicity, that the abomination of autocracy, as Nietzsche puts it, in any field, political, moral, aesthetic, whatever it might be, that is productive.
So there's something actually like about the recent election in America that I just don't think a lot of people have noticed, but I think the democratic process functioned extremely well, because I think all of us were well aware that people were going fucking nuts on the internet. Like everybody was like gearing up for civil war. What if all his, and I think his predictions weren't off base. He just might have magnituded them a little bit too much. But
talking to Odin too much.
He was saying that he was saying
I think he's
that
been talking to Loki, actually.
Yeah,
that would explain a lot.
Well, like people were like Luigi and all that showed up, so it wasn't like he was wrong. I think it was just a quantitative issue, but I think he was directionally correct. But basically, he was saying, "Oh, there'll be a civil war and all this, and everything's heating up this way." And like it was very like the reason why he was doing, people were listening is because it was like, yeah, this makes sense. But I did notice that the kind of contest really forced out of the right wing and like inventiveness. Like you see Musk, and he did a very interesting way of essentially seizing power and installing himself in government. A lot of people wouldn't like it. I understand, like a lot of people would be like, that guy's kind of like a tyrant right now or something like this. Fair enough. But it did like, it shows you that there was a sublimation of actual violence that would have happened with like an ancient king. And instead it was all forced to be civilized in a weird way. And for this reason, it's actually been kind of hilarious and strange. Like you have this like ultimate tech nerd being like, we need to get to Mars, so I'm going to go and help this like billionaire meme lord. Yeah. And we're going to pull him out. And it's just very weird the way that's happened. And I'm not saying it's perfect, but you see this sort of contest has been politicized in an interesting way. Like Musk and Trump are outsiders. They're coming from real estate and tech, and they're really like shunting things over. So maybe it's an argument for this
disagree.
idea of like,
here's where I disagree. I understand what you're saying.
Go on.
Yes.
The idea of like maybe it's an argument for, it's maybe a case study of like how these type of competitions could potentially be fertile to create novel situations, like, for example, Trump marrying into the presidency. Who knows? So there's something interesting in there. Maybe that would be the correct way to understand democracy, is that as long as you supplement violence, it's kind of getting in the right direction, if you think about it. And usually it forces people to think differently. And I think this has actually been a case study. It hasn't been politics as usual anyway.
I sort of see what you're saying regarding the competition and the democracy here. Where I would disagree, though, is that there seems to be one Trump, there is one Musk. I don't see Bezos as being the same kind of thing, for example. And the reason why I'm saying this is I wish that there were different kinds of Elon Musks that were all competing with each other and different kinds of Trump-like personalities. But because they're one, we have all these people who are, fanboying, soyboying around these people, as opposed to having like different ones competing to be the best. And as a result, this is why you're having, I think, this stagflation of all these MAGA boomers who, nothing's being created here. They're just like worshiping like cattle.
A better focus, yeah, because people will always do that. A better focus, though, is exactly what you just said. Like, why haven't Zuckerberg and Bezos stepped up? Because you notice when Musk has been pushing this way, Zuckerberg has showed up with a fucking gold chain and he's like jacked on TRT. So like these guys are starting to get a little bit braver because they were shy little shrews before.
Yes.
And now Musk has displayed a little bit of inventiveness. Again, you don't have to agree with Musk. Like, I think Musk is going to make a lot of mistakes. I think it's inevitable. But it's just this idea that like he's taking risks. And you notice that there was this sort of like just deadening where everybody was like a career politician and the whole thing was just about like keep the system. And it's interesting now because you kind of do look at like Bezos and be like, you could really do something with all that money and go crazy and try inventive things and be creative and think outside the box. And you actually don't, because you lack imagination. You don't have a pair of balls. That's really what it comes down to. Like, there's two billionaires after really changing things and you don't agree with them. Fine. There's a lot of reasons to argue against them. There's a lot of stupidity in the conservatives and the MAGA movement. That's, yes, true. But it's like the field is open. And it's like that Greek competition situation. It's like, all right, well, why is there why aren't people getting competitive? Why aren't people taking risks? Why aren't people doing crazy stuff, So it's interesting. It kind of leans to that idea that like a real democracy is not this drab, overly moral, almost like religious event where you have like a rolling forever party, because that's what East Germany was like, where just the party never lost. Instead, a real democracy is like an insane asylum where you have all these maniacs always competing for power, and and then it for some reason that actually does lead to like something that's at least progressive and fertile. You can't say the politics and the conversation and the world has not changed in the last 2 years since Musk says I'm going to take risks.
Well, it's like relatively fertile, absolutely. But the problem is that if you're talking about the philosophy of Musk and the people that are around him, I'd say even more the people that are around him. It's particularly obvious if you ever go into any of these X spaces, you just see these people that are completely unrelated to any of the kind of conversations that we're having. They have like some monkey avatar or whatever. They're just like some people who came onto this thing, a couple of years ago. And these are people who don't have any philosophy other than the grind set. And
there's a real
crypto Bitcoin grind set bro thing. And it's just like, the founding fathers wouldn't like that very much. But
there's also a really funny version of this coming from the right, from MAGA. And this would be like the just kind of humiliating simping that people do. Because Musk is like, he has 13 children and 10 of them are IVF. And you have all these like Christian right-wingers just like slobbering at his feet and stuff like this, and you're like, this guy's like, he's literally like, Bill Gates is going to vaccinate us, and Musk is like, I will literally drill a hole in your head and put a microchip in your brain, and people are like, wow, he's so based, he's so great. So it is very funny like how people humiliate themselves. But I guess my point is more like the bigger figures, like it's Bezos and Zuckerberg. They're the ones you want to press and be like,
But what's their philosophy and what's Musk's philosophy? That's the other thing that it's missing here. Like, yes, he wants to go to Mars, he wants to advance humanity, but like for the sake of what? I think for the sake of what is something that George Washington and Thomas Jefferson would have been able to elucidate. I'm not sure that the people who are, these big idols today are able to do that. That seems to be like the real emptiness here. I don't know, like Keegan, what do you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, that what comes to mind to me is the distrust that goes back all the way to the time of the Greeks and that Nietzsche shared towards businessmen and towards the field of business as a selection mechanism for who should be in charge, basically. And many people don't know this about Nietzsche, because, at least for a time, not so much anymore. There was a time when Nietzsche was sort of like melded together with Ayn Rand in the public consciousness as sort of like both standing for the same sort of viewpoint of like personal excellence and ambition and so on and so forth. But a really key difference between them is that some comments Nietzsche makes in The Gay Science and also in later books of Human All Too Human, where he says that one of the main drivers of socialism in his time, at least the way he sees it, is the fact that the factory worker goes and he punches in, and then he looks to the boss, and he looks at that guy and says, wow, he's really no better than I am. I don't see any essential difference between him and me. And one of the points Nietzsche makes is that in the money market and in the stock market of the time, vast sums of money can be made incredibly quickly. Occasionally, it can be due to things like luck. Occasionally, it can be due to things like you just happen to be in the right place at the right time with the right amount of capital. There are all these sort of like randomizing factors in capitalism that, and more importantly, perhaps to Nietzsche, he would have pointed out that in ancient times, aristocracies had like a sacred aura around them, even if it wasn't true. Machiavelli talks about this as well, that there was a sort of sense that the people who ruled were actually, beloved by the gods. And I believe I've talked about this with Steph on his podcast, but that there was an actual obligation among the Roman patricians to sacrifice themselves in battle if the battle wasn't going well. This was an actual ritual where the commander would commit his soul to Dis and then go throw himself into the enemy lines alone as a sacrifice. And Livy records a incident where a Roman general named Musaeus does this, and it actually freaked out the Gauls so much that they win the battle. They couldn't understand. They're like, why is this guy just killing himself? This doesn't make any sense. And, Livy reports that they ran to and fro and seemed totally disorganized after that, and their morale completely broke. One of the other interesting things is that Peter Turchin talks about how in the Roman civil wars, the patricians died at a much higher rate, proportionate to their population, than the plebeians did. So if you were a Roman patrician, I think like 3 out of 100 of them were killed in the civil wars. Whereas like more plebeians died as an absolute number, but it was like way less. You had a much better chance of living, just if you're like an ordinary soldier. Why was this? Because they were expected to lead from the front, and that there was an actual like glory involved with dying in the name of patria. And so I don't know how you recreate that in the modern world, right? Some sort of selection mechanism.
Quick aside regarding what you just said right now with the Russians. We had an imperial Russia. You could read about this in Tolstoy books, for instance. The aristocracy, back when you had the formation of all of these artillery, firings, all these things of modern warfare, you still had these aristocrats who had to stand and thought it was shameful if they were to duck some incoming firepower at them. Just think about that mentality. Like, that to me speaks to exactly what you were talking about right now, Keegan, how these people didn't see, I guess, kind of like a Mishima type of thing. They didn't see life as being just for the sake of living on and on. It was more of a test. Like, now that you're given this chance to live, can you build yourself up, and can you also sacrifice yourself maybe towards some greater ideal, which, if we're talking about like with people like Survive the Jive, for instance, Tom Rosel, a friend of the show who I had on several times recently with Neil, his whole conception, I'm curious what you guys think of this, has to do with we pass away and then we reincarnate if we acted in a good way back within like our family, our clan. And if we're like really, really good, like if we, fought a war valiantly, then we go into Valhalla. And that's where we're going to stay until, the Ragnarok, the end of days, the battle of the gods. So that is definitely a motivator, I think, for people to act that certain way and to be this golden representation of honor, civility, virtue to all of the other people, and kind of like make all these other people fall in line into, acting a certain, positive way. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I think, it's funny you bring that up. I remember when Dan Carlin did his whole like special on World War I, he talks about the French like officers doing the same thing and just getting torn to shreds by like artillery fire. And that the real, like, the beginning of modernity happens over the course of World War I, because by the end of World War I, no one's doing that. That basically that sort of like old conception of valor is basically dead. because it doesn't make any sense anymore in this like mechanistic form of warfare, this like industrial form of warfare that characterizes the modern world. And I don't know. I guess so. My conception of things would be that to really have, I don't know, like some sort of figure that people can really idealize and get behind as like a new like cultural hero or something like that. You have to have somebody who is, that you get that sense they have that aura about them, that they're willing to, people would say that about George Washington as well, by the way, that he would, stand up under like bullet fire and not, there's probably quite a few myths attached to Washington that I'm very suspicious of, but at least that's what's talked about of him. Well, there's that one. Yeah. There's also like myths about like, he had bullet holes in his jacket, but they didn't pass through his body and God was looking after him and so on and so forth. I think that's all sort of like a romanticization of the fact that something Xenophon says, I believe, where he says that something he noticed over the course of, fighting in wars is that those who had the least concern for their lives are the ones who came home from battle. Sort of like a paradox. The ones who were the most concerned and the most, thinking discretion's the better part of valor and trying to preserve their lives are the ones who are more likely to get killed. So that's very interesting as well. There's something Seneca says that fortune gives or cowards a wide berth. That fortune, providence will send calamities to the bravest people, and she'll steer clear of those who aren't prepared for it in some way. But I guess what I'm saying is like I don't think there's any analog in the modern world for pruning the elite, as Peter Turchin would talk about it. It doesn't really happen in the business world in the same way, right? You can lose all of your money and go bankrupt and still at the end of the day, like live better than most people, right? You're not going to be like put to death for, the people who like fucked everyone over in Enron or whatever are not, or they weren't executed in the public square. There's no like real consequences oftentimes for like usury, parasitism, or just, in general, just like, I mean, we could ask a serious question as to whether or not something like Amazon has actually made us better. Like it's improved our lives in terms of convenience, but is more convenience better? Is like another further question that we could ask.
It depends on how you use your time, right? Because somebody
Sure.
who lived in ancient Greece back then, like another thing, fellas, like we can't forget that a lot of these noble ancient Greek philosopher kangs, of democracy, they had slaves. They weren't doing all of this, like the sweeping and the carrying of the fruits and all that, right? Like they had this system. You could say almost like maybe we can have that with some kind of an AI system that would do a lot of this stuff for us. But that is the other tricky thing here, because now we have mass man. And mass man back in the day, while not necessarily a slave, they would be living like a peasant life somewhere, growing food, things like that. But now their point of view is also responsible for the people that get elected, for what is considered to be good culture, for the popular music of the day. And it's not even so much that it's their choice. It's more of they act as nodes for, people to, unleash their advertising upon all these boomers, and then all these boomers, as well as the iPad babies, start to mimic whatever it is they're being advertised. And now you have just this horrible incestuous circle of, the worst taste being promulgated, while in the past, like those people would have probably just been like, growing food somewhere and raising chickens, and the philosophy and culture, all of that was left to the aristocrats. Those were the ones who were, busying themselves with that. So what do you make of this strange situation right now, where you have like the people who in the past never really had a chance to even be a cultural node, now being probably responsible in a really, really big way through just like the sheer amount of them, for the kind of culture and the kind of aesthetics, bringing it back to art here that we're living in.
A really quick point on that, and I'll kick it over to Steph. One of the things Tolstoy says when he's beginning that essay, What is Art, is he's talking about all of the work and labor that goes into like building an opera house and then maintaining the opera house and putting on the operas, and all the people who have to be paid in order to build things and do wardrobe and costumes and so on and so forth. And he brings up, he's like, in the Greek and Roman days, they would have had slaves do this, and they didn't see that as any problem. But we, remember Tolstoy's a Christian. He's like, we who understand the brotherhood of man and the essential equality of people, we recognize that this is an evil, right? And so art has to justify itself to redeem this evil that is required of it. Because then that's a point that Nietzsche makes, that basically all leisure time, all creativity is basically made possible by parasitism, by the fact that some people are laboring, doing what we might call like productive labor that provides sustenance for people and keeps the supply chains going. To whatever degree that has to exist so that some people can make art, right? And perhaps like the socialist vision would be, we're going to distribute leisure time to everybody. Nietzsche's fear is that what you're actually going to do is you're going to distribute the obligation to labor to everyone, and no one will have any leisure time. And that explains a lot of his opposition to socialism, is that it will actually be the death of odium. It will be the death of leisure time. And so, there is that issue there, right? Of that in all art and creativity, or just cultural capital, it seems that by necessity, you sort of have to have like a few people do that while other people are supporting it. And it is a very interesting situation. I mean, as we continue to automate the economy and as you talk about with AI, I mean, maybe we will reach a position one day when everyone's getting like a UBI and robots are doing all of the labor, and everyone can like try their hand at something creative and dynamic or something of that nature. It sounds like, a fairy tale, but again, that's one of those ideas that even if it's never realized, like is worth, I think, contemplating of what could we do if we freed everybody from like the burden of labor? Or would it be, as you point out, a race to the bottom and the lowest common denominator? Is that what we would see?
One thing you think about with that is if you look at like the golden age of rock, it was basically the 60s until the 90s, maybe the early 90s. And like you can make a very good argument that was one of the high points in production of creative work in Western history ever. And that's the reason why America stands as like the cultural, like, the America just dominated the 20th century. You had cinema and you had rock. And it's just like, that is clear. Like cinema is clearly birth of tragedy level genius art that you've never seen before in history, brought to the level of perfection. That's just shocking. It's shocking to think of even what films are. Like you watch Fight Club and you're like, this is so much better than a novel in every possible way, except obviously the imagination. It's quite astounding. And it's really, really fascinating that that's a competitive situation where because it's like lean American capitalism, dude, like a lot of people can participate in the American capitalism project, and a lot of people can make music. And so a lot of bands show up, and there's a huge turnover of bands, and they have a sort of Greek birth of tragedy golden age competition for several decades. It's really, really good. And like, the peak of the 70s and the 80s is exceptional music. And the films that come out of the 80s and the 90s are just unbelievable. Like they're really, really good. And we haven't seen anything since. And interestingly, the second we get the internet, which is an open distribution, where everybody can be creative. That's how the internet has been sold to us. Everybody can be creative in the internet. It's like automation. Everybody can upload their SoundCloud. Everybody can upload their film on YouTube. You can do this all the time now if you want. And as a consequence, everything's gotten shit. Everything has just gone wrong. Everything has gotten broken because the competition died. The best YouTubers are Mr. Beast, which is just like spurged out autism. I'm bashing on the autists. Love the autists, I don't mean to be this way, but like ADHD videos, it's crap. It's not like it's McDonald's music. It's McDonald's videos.
McDonald's music.
compared to like a film like Fight Club, which is 2 hours of just nearly perfection, where you pay $15 and you sit down and you're like, all right, experience for 2 hours. That's amazing. That's just like, it's like symphony orchestra level good. And you compare this to YouTube, and like, there's just no incentive to make high quality films on YouTube, which is why there's never been any. YouTube is designed for people like us ranting all the time, because it's just the way the incentives work it's like a down-going thing. Joe Rogan is so popular on YouTube for a reason, because just casual talking is necessary for this. So weirdly, the internet is like freedom of information and very, very enlightening in many ways, but not in any way creatively productive. And you see the same with music. Like everybody has a SoundCloud. Nobody makes good music anymore. The music is like really, really struggling. Now, obviously, if you go really searching, it's there, but the rewards are way smaller. Like if like a band at your level, I'd imagine, could have actually realistically made like really serious money back in the day from doing tours and selling records. But like a lot of that is just killed off now. And you have to distribute really heavily, and then you have to do your tours, and it doesn't even pay as good as, and like if you have to overcharge if you really want to make money, and then you have to go merch heavy. So all of a sudden it's very fascinating how that has worked. So it seems like that flicker of the golden age was there because of a unique combination of things that are very hard to recreate. And an awful lot of our modern philosophy now about, like, as Keegan's saying, we promise we're like AI automation and you'll all be free to be artists. We'll just get Mr. Beast. People will optimize for ad revenue or something. Whereas the actual thing you want is like, you want a way to structure competition, even massive inequality, which existed in the 70s and the 80s. A lot of people who wanted to make bands and failed. But because there was massive inequality, it was actually possible for like a real competition to happen. And there was probably a bigger diversity of good creators doing a lot of different stuff, which is why like the catalogs from those periods of time just really stand out. You know, it's that type of thing.
I think I've got like kind of maybe a nuance to bring to this, because I think that I see exactly what you're talking about in terms of like YouTube. There's no incentive to make like in-depth content. Like if you find it, it's always great, right? But the real incentive is to make clickbait. That's like where all the incentives are aligned to. How do I get people to click on this?
Well, and sorry to interrupt, but that's true. But just think about just one other caveat, because this is, again, like the really dangerous. You have clickbait, but you also have the streamer. I look at all the guys just a bit younger than me, Sneeko, Fuentes, like a lot. Like I was talking to an Argentine girl the other day, and she said in Argentina, the celebrities now are all streamers. Streamers is the thing. Now, what is streaming? Streaming is literally the least effort you can ever put into content. And like, I'm good at it. I can rant, and like you can talk really well as well. But it's like there's this massive down going. So sorry to interrupt. Please
no, I mean, I agree. I think that, yeah. So there is that in it. You know, if you look at it from that angle, I think again, a lot of the problem is it's like the double-edged sword of capitalism, because it is capital efficiency that creates that incentive. There is a reason why the algorithm operates the way it does. It's to maximize the amount of time that eyeballs are spent looking at their site, so you can maximize the amount of time that advertisers get to capture some of that time with those eyeballs. And so, but on the other hand, I wouldn't have a podcast or be able to do any of the Nietzsche podcast if that didn't exist, right? And so there is an element of it that I think, you know, what I brought up earlier of like the idealistic vision of like robots do all the work and we have like all the chance to be creative. I think that too could also turn into like, you know, just slop. But I think that there is something valuable about like subsidizing the arts. And I've seen this in Europe insofar as there are community spaces for like live music to occur that are funded by the government. And I don't know much about the politics of this, but I do know that when I went over there and played over there, there are places that couldn't exist otherwise, and that basically allow for there to be like an actual like artistic community, like a scene that is able to exist, that I think is like incredibly valuable. I'm very glad and very grateful that I've been able to be part of like a musical scene where it's like a physical place where people gather and enjoy art together, that many people don't have that experience now. You know, it's not something that they are involved in. And, you know, they're either listening to music alone at home, or, you know, they just, you know, they go to like a big concert, like they go see like these top tier artists, the top 10 or whatever. And it's not a community at all. It's almost like, it's like when you have too many hens and they can't have a pecking order. It's not the same thing. You really need like a little community within Dunbar's number, right? Of like 200 or less people or so on and so forth, or maybe an extended family of scenes or something like that. And so I've been very grateful for that. And I do look at how like we had like a bar here in Austin, a venue that was like the anchor of the local metal scene. And it wasn't like they weren't doing well financially. They were doing very well. But one day, the guy who owns the property got a cash offer for $3 million. Whoops, it's a condo. And that happened like just a couple months ago. And, people can call it socialist or whatever. I don't really give a shit. I kind of wish that like the government just said like, no, this is like a cultural like anchor. You can't do that. Sorry. Yeah. We're going to stop you from doing that. Yeah.
Well, with the USSR, I just want to give a quick example. With the USSR, they subsidized theater production. So you actually had a lot of genius, theater directors and such who were kind of skating against the censorship of the Soviet Union, because a lot of those commissars didn't even understand what the fuck they were saying. But the point is that was one of the nice parts about, even me who hates, communism. That was one of the really nice parts about Soviet Russia, is that they did kind of respect that kind of art that cannot really be, infected by the spirit of, mercantilism.
So an interesting red pill on this is to look at temples or churches, because when you have like an entirely parallel institution that's almost like non-political but has huge social capital as it is, that actually becomes really powerful at setting foundations. So like the monasteries and the abbeys and stuff like that in ancient Europe set the foundation for an awful lot of the choral music, which turned obviously into symphonic classical music. And even in the ancient world, like you see in Egypt, the same thing. The temples were like the seats of commerce, and they like disciplined the worst instincts of capitalism. It would be the merchants back then, if you so will. So it's interesting that like that is there as well, that like you create these sacred spaces that aren't allowed to be about pure profit. They have to be about, higher ideals, and they become also the monetary engine of the community, which is what like churches were like, or temples. And pagan in Rome, pagan temples were the same thing. And that just for some reason just makes a lot of things click very well. And when that type of stuff breaks down, that's where you start to see serious problems happen and all these type of things. So maybe there's something, there definitely is something there, and it's very hard to get right. With a lot of these things, it's very hard to figure out. But Lev, I'm gonna have to bounce soon. I was wondering if you have any super chats and all that, if you want to do any questions.
So we have one super chat over here from King of Biltong, $30, who says, increase your protein intake with some healthy meat snacks. Biltong is packed with B12, creatine, iron, zinc, and much more. Get yours at biltongusa.com. Use code word BTR to get 10% off. Guys, there is a package that's coming for me tomorrow because I get the Biltong from the King of Biltong over here, Anton. And I gotta say, it goes after like a single day. I gain weight. It's not a good situation. I have to control myself. I cannot be like this. I cannot just like start eating carbonasi sausage one after another. But this is the power of the Biltong. I'm telling you guys, you have to have somebody tie you up like they tied up Odysseus, so that he can, maybe take a little bite of that sausage, but not the whole thing, because it is that good. And if you guys go to biltongusa.com, then you shall receive the best Biltong you've ever had. Have you guys had any Biltong ever, or no?
Lev, no. Was that a real super chat?
That was a real super chat. He's a sponsor. He's a sponsor of the show.
This is the race to the bottom of capitalism we were talking about earlier, destroying
Lev, you're like the case study, Lev. We're there trying to talk about deep things, and then we have the King of Biltong come in. Biltong is excellent. Lev actually showed me some Biltong in New York. And I was like, this is the Americans do this thing where they dry meat. So in Spain, we don't do it in Ireland, but in Spain, they dry pork and chorizo. It's gorgeous. And then you guys do beef. And like sometimes like other hunted animals. I'm like, what is this? This is nice. So good stuff. Very impressive.
Absolutely. But that's the kind of stuff that we have to do now to survive. So that's the other question. Can we balance out, creating art and philosophy and all that good stuff with, at the same time, having enough people to have a bit of a support network? Because like with yourself, Keegan, you are a musician. What do you find is in common with the people who enjoy your music as well as philosophy? Like, because you have an audience, but it's not like Taylor Swift kind of audience. So what is it that differentiates them from the onset? Is it their family influence? Like, could you point to what it may be?
I think there is a desire for a sensory experience that is beyond the pale of normal like sensory experience. I mean, I'm involved with a genre that's very much like high volume, very low, loud, long songs, and there is something about like the intensity of that again, to compare it again, it is Dionysian to at least some extent. And there is like a whole countercultural element to it as well, to some extent. Not countercultural in the sense of, I mean, it's almost like a, how would I put it? It's almost like an atavistic like yearning to just stay in the year 1969 and not develop at all musically, and just play really loud rock music in perpetuity, right? And you know, take that or leave it. There are, you know, I would say in other genres of music like black metal, they've actually had cults, you know, sort of like actual ideologies and sort of like a real like meaning or philosophy behind the music. And that's existed in various forms of like, people would say that occurred in the 60s too, right? But the genre that I play, not so much. Very, very like, you could even say resignationist at times. Just sort of, we're all doomed, and you know, plug in, drop out, that kind of thing. But the what I think is valuable is community as such, not necessarily what it's based around, and the fact that there's a real sense of camaraderie. I mean, when I go to a metal show, you know, you see a bunch of dudes with leather jackets and denim vests and stuff, but everyone's hugging each other, everyone's smiling, everyone is glad to see one another. People are very eager to help one another out. I would say that
clean up after themselves too, right? Like, it's a very, at least I heard, metal's like a very clean community. Like, they don't put litter everywhere, you know, after the show. Like, they make sure to tidy up.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically, I would say, a lot of the things that people might get from like a church style community in the past, in this secular age, a lot of us find it within like a musical community or something like that. And I think that exists with like many subgenres and like niche genres of music. And they're not all the same. Like, you know, I would imagine in like electronica music, there probably isn't that like level of camaraderie necessarily. But that's really what I like about it is, you know, the sense of brotherhood or sisterhood I have with many people involved, and everyone tries to uplift each other, and it's very nice, actually.
It's beautiful. And I would ask Steph, before you go, Steph, the same question. The audience that you've developed over time, what do you notice is in common with it, regardless of, you know, whether their interest is this thing or that thing? Like, could you point to something that...
How do you mean in what sense?
Well, in the sense of what exactly draws people to the kind of things that you're drawn to.
Oh, reactionary conspiracies. That's the main thing that a lot of us share. I've met like I think there's two things with the internet, all right? So the internet is extremely parasocial. So if you're going to like a music festival, and like what Keegan's doing, like you know, I've been in mosh pits before, and you get knocked over and you get picked up, and it's a human thing, and it's Dionysian. I wrote an introduction for Giorgiani, not Giorgiani. I was to Constantine, who was wrote a thing on the birth of tragedy, and this is the thing I focused on: is the sense difference. You can categorize your senses. Your ears and your eyes used wavelengths of energy to create your senses. You don't actually touch anything with your ears or your eyes. It's all action at a distance. You see light and you see color because of wavelengths. It's all waves happening through energy. Same with sound. It's vibrations. So it's intellectual. So you can literally go to an opera house and not touch anything and experience the music, and you have this sort of mind orgasm. It's very intellectual. It's Apollonian cerebral. Now, the Dionysian senses all require you to touch things. When you smell something, you're literally having particles touch your nose. When you taste something, there's literally something touching your tongue. When you feel something, there's literally something touching your hands. So in order for you to have a Dionysian downward senses, animalistic senses, like think of dogs. Dogs literally sniff the floor and lick shit and touch stuff. Whereas us men, you know, we walk around looking in distances. We're actually very unique in this way. Very few animals stand up and look around in the way that we do. It's quite interesting. So most animals are hunched over, you know. And this is something you notice about like festivals and you have rock bands, and you go into the mosh pit and you fall over, and the music is kind of like there stimulating your ears, but really you're there because you're like bashing against each other and you're smelling stuff and you're feeling the speakers hit your chest. That's the point of it. That's why rock music is so Dionysian, such a great experience. It's so much different than opera. Like opera is you kind of sit around and it's, you know, sophisticated. You're in your little cubby up there looking down. Whereas like a rock and roll, the 60s is like you're blasted off your face in psychedelics. You're probably having sex with someone and then you're coming out and you're like dancing. It's way different. It's a way different experience because it stimulates the somatic senses and the senses of touch and the senses of taste. And it's a different experience in this way. Now, the internet, our entire predicate of our culture, the internet is completely un-Dionysian. It's completely Apollonian. It's completely eyes and ears. It's completely broken in this way. It's very, very bad. So it leads to this hugely parasocial experience, this hugely over-intellectualized experience, this hugely over-stimulating but hollow experience. People can like get so informed via the internet and feel like they've felt there's no soul in it. They felt nothing because of this exact problem. This is the exact problem that you see. There's no touch, there's no taste. It's, you know, the internet creates the incel because the incel has no touch, taste, or experience of reality, but they have endless knowledge that they can venture through. Then they can go play video games, which is, again, an entirely Apollonian sight and sound stimulation of the mind, but no feeling, this type of thing. And people go buy sex dolls to make up for this. So my experience, an awful lot of people like who with a very online audience like myself, we're massive conspiracy heads. We're like informed about the craziest stuff ever. But I take a lot of time to meet people. Like I've met you, for example, Lev. I'm traveling a lot. I've met a hell of a lot of people in the last year, especially because I think COVID made all that worse. And I do notice that there's a lot of people like very obsessed with health. And I'm noticing there's a type of person that is getting formed right now that is almost like a Renaissance man, where they are like completely sovereign and independent. They're obsessed about their health. They're obsessed about like creating their own new relationships because they don't trust most people in their lives anymore because they think they're all, you know, going to get tricked by the government. They're highly informed. They're usually into like investing. They've studied business with entrepreneurship at some point. So the kind of Renaissance man the internet is creating is actually a really adaptable, well put together person, which I think is an ideal that we all should be encouraging. The only hollow points I see in it is that we're very conspiracy prone, and we're not very artistic generation. I rarely meet artists anymore properly, and like, you know, Keegan's doing this, but it's interesting. It's interesting to me that like that seems like more of a personal subculture than like an internet subculture, and I think there's like big issues with this type of stuff. And there's a couple of writers and stuff like that around, but I've noticed that there's been like a breakdown of that type of stuff. So these are the things I see with my audience and all this. And as I've said, I've met a lot of them. And I do see like a lot of health and a lot of this yearning to go on hikes and connect with nature and get and touch grass and all this type of stuff and meet people and all this. That's very strong, which is good, and it countervails the kind of parasocial nature of the internet. So there's some suggestions.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if Keegan, if you have any final thoughts on this before we conclude.
Yeah, I'll give one final thought. I think that maybe what you're noticing, the lack of artistic fire or whatever it is, the lack of creative fire for you know, to do something artistic and irrational, make music, make paintings, write the great American novel. You know, a lot of people who wrote, you know, two of my favorite television shows of the 60s were The Twilight Zone and Star Trek. Both the guys, Rod Serling and Gene Roddenberry, who created those, fought in World War II and saw a lot of death, had a lot of very insane limit experiences and traumatizing experiences. And I'm not saying everyone who has to make great art has to be a war veteran or something like that, but they like really lived their lives. Like they had life experiences. And that is a Dionysian thing, to put it in vulgar terms. Going out into physical space and having those somatic, tactile, you know, touching reality. And sometimes that's brutal to touch reality. But I think a lot of the artistic like nadir that we're experiencing is there are quite a few people sitting in a writer's room of like a committee of 28 people writing an episode of something who have never had any experience outside of what it's like to be a writer in LA. And that's not really a very, you know, I feel that I could, and I'm not really there yet, but I've had enough crazy experiences where I've already kind of written memoir a little bit about it, But I'm like, man, I could actually write like a really crazy novel based on what it's like to be a touring musician, based on a lot of the crazy things I've seen. And plus, if I fictionalize it, then I can have like plausible deniability about some of the things that have gone on.
Well, you're
But yeah, I
giving
think
it
it's
away
like
now.
you need life, but that's what I would say is like you need those Dionysian life experiences. That's part of like the Dionysian element. Call it barbarism, call it frenzy, or just plain old, touching the real, touching grass, touching nature. That I think is the spark of the creative fire of art. And so maybe there will be, maybe the more chaos we have and the more, dislocations and just upheavals in the modern world, maybe on the other side of that, it will be another productive tension, and that will create some more artistic Renaissance men.
I definitely think so. I don't know, Steph, as a final thing, do you agree or do you disagree with anything so far that Keegan has said? Just to make sure.
So to illustrate his point, it's like, again, with this Dionysian thing of the senses, what I was saying at the start about that whole centering of the body, you can't have an experience unless you put your body in danger. Like if you're going to go meet a girl, you have to show your body up in front of her, and you have to like look at her and talk to her, and you have to take the risk of her being like, wow, you're bleh, like, I don't want you, so that's like a physical embodied experience. You can do it over the internet, certainly, but the final steps have to happen through the body. If you're going to go and fight someone, it has to happen. The body has to show up, and the body has to be in danger of getting damaged or killed. You're going to go to war. The reason why war is scary, the reason why the Ukraine war is freaky, is because machines do the fighting and they kill bodies. And that's what's scary about it, is that you're going there and you're not fighting man to man, you're fighting machine versus man. That's the kind of eerie experience of modern war. So I think a lot of those guys, they put their bodies on the line, and we don't even do that in our normal lives that much anymore, because we've abstracted so much onto the internet. So it's an interesting, I think this is just a huge, huge challenge for our culture, is like, how do we, it's the birth of tragedy problem. We have this huge separation into the internet, Apollonian autism, and we're going to be in a fucked up, stuck culture for a significant period of time. I think maybe until we can synthesize those two forces into like an embodied way that justifies it and tames it. And we might potentially have this just explosive, insane golden age if that happens. But there's also an equal chance that we end up in like AI perpetual spurg slavery if we're not careful. So that could be there as well. So I think that'll be my last thoughts on that.
And gentlemen, before we go, I just want to say that there is one way we can definitely start merging these two worlds together, because I think that what you're talking about right now is absolutely on point. The way that we do it is we actually go out, we meet in real life. Here we have Steph, myself, and Jason Giorgiani, the great Jason Giorgiani, next to the statue of Atlas over here in Rock, 30 Rock. And we were going after the show, the Christmas special, which you guys can check out on breaktherules.tv, on the YouTube channel. Here we are at this Japanese sake restaurant place, and here I am with a couple of friends and patrons over here. So if you want to grow this thing, and yes, I understand that this is 100% shilling, but it is an important kind of shilling, because it's the kind where it could actually help bring a lot of these people, a lot of these like-minded people together. I have all these different events, and if you go to patreon.com/breaktherules, become a patron today, a $20 patronage is going to give you the ability to go to those events and hang out and be in the audience when the next shows are going to be happening, and and just help grow a lot of this real life combination of all of these very, very cool people. And I would not be able to do this without you guys. And it was a great pleasure today to talk with yourself, Keegan, Essential Thoughts, and yourself, Steph. Keegan, where could people find you, and also your music?
You can find my YouTube channel, Essential Salts, at Untimely Reflections. That's on YouTube. Some of my music is there as well. Look up Slumbering Sun if you want to hear what I'm doing now musically. That's on every platform, Spotify, wherever you want to find it. And pretty much it. Excellent. And yourself, Steph, what do you got coming up?
I'm on X and I'm on YouTube. I'm actually trying to figure out a way that I can do good writing and combine it with making YouTube videos. This is something I've been pondering for a while, because I notice when I write, I go Apollonian mode and I go very penetrating into my thoughts. like, for example, some of these ideas here I'm presenting come from clear writing, but I can't sit down on the microphone and rant. And I'm trying to work on that. So I kind of have something, maybe like a book coming up. I've been posting podcasts on Substack and putting them there as like examples of this thesis, if you will. But I'm looking at this. I've also been like writing kind of fiction. I'm actually kind of excited because we were talking about the artistic need. I looked at the Red Book by Carl Jung, and I've kind of like tried to do a fiction version of this. I've been using AI to try illustrate this to get kind of like basic animations. It's a little bit uncanny, but I'm wondering if I can keep pushing that, maybe it'll turn into something. So I'm at a lot of different things. I'm on Substack, that's paid. I'm on YouTube. I'm on X. I'm doing a little bit of fiction writing. I'm doing a little bit of proper writing. Hopefully I'll show some of that content off coming soon in the next while. We'll see what we can get. But
coaching, are you still doing coaching?
Sort of. I'm not focusing on it a huge amount, but I think it's a big deal right now. Like a lot of what I do with coaching is help people if they want to build brands and things like this. And I'm like looking at what AI is up to, and I'm like, man, this is huge. So I could start shilling that, but I think, Lev, you've shilled enough, so I don't bother the audience. The dollar signs will flash too heavy, so we'll betray it. But that's what I'm up to right now.
Excellent.
You guys use dollars in Ireland? I thought it was still gold coins.
Man, you hegemon of the world, please, man. We use dollars everywhere. There's McDonald's in every village, man. Like you use of one.
And
it's
with
the Hellenism.
Indeed. And with that, guys, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, click the bell, yada, yada, yada. Thank you guys so much. Mwah. Good night, everybody. Bye-bye.